Hi, I'm Victoria. They told me I didn't belong at the company party, called me a charity case in front of everyone, and laughed when I tried to contribute to the conversation. My husband's boss made it clear that wives like me were just decoration, nothing more. But that night, when I opened my father's old leather portfolio and spread those documents across the table, the laughter died in their throats. What happens when the woman they dismiss turns out to own everything they're fighting for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was folding Tyler's soccer jersey when Daniel walked through the front door, his tie already loosened and his laptop bag slung over one shoulder. The late afternoon light filtered through our Beaverton kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the granite countertops we'd saved 3 years to afford. He moved with that particular exhaustion that meant another 12-hour day at Cascade Tech Solutions, another day of fixing other people's code while his boss took credit for the innovations. He kissed my forehead absently, the way couples do after 8 years of marriage when affection becomes automatic rather than intentional. "Richard wants me at the company party tomorrow night," he said, pulling a cream-colored envelope from his jacket pocket. "Apparently it's mandatory for senior engineers and their spouses." I took the invitation, noting the expensive cardstock and embossed logo. Cascade Tech Solutions Annual Excellence Gala. The Pearl District Rooftop Club. Black tie optional. My stomach tightened just reading it. These weren't our people. Daniel worked with them, sure, but we'd never been invited into their inner circle. We were the ones who lived in the suburbs and drove a Honda Civic with a car seat in the back. "Do we have to go?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the way his shoulders sagged. "Richard made it pretty clear that missing it would be a career-limiting move," Daniel said, opening the refrigerator and staring at its contents like they might provide answers. "He's been riding me hard lately about the Henderson project. I think he's looking for reasons to pass me over for the promotion again." I set the invitation on the counter next to Tyler's permission slip for the upcoming field trip. 2 different worlds, separated by a piece of paper. One where my 8-year-old son needed me to remember to pack his lunch and sign his forms, and another where I was expected to make small talk with people who measured worth in stock options and quarterly bonuses. "What about Tyler?" I asked. "Mrs. Chen can't babysit tomorrow night." "Bring him," Daniel said, finally settling on a leftover container of pasta. Richard mentioned that some of the other executives are bringing their kids. Apparently, there's going to be a separate area set up for them. That should have been my first warning sign. When companies segregate the children, they're usually planning conversations the kids shouldn't hear. But I nodded, already mentally cataloging what we owned that might pass for appropriate attire. My black dress from our wedding anniversary dinner 2 years ago would have to work. Daniel's navy suit needed pressing, but it would do. That night, after Tyler fell asleep, clutching his stuffed elephant, I stood in our walk-in closet staring at clothes that suddenly felt inadequate. Everything looked tired, worn at the edges in ways that spoke of careful budgeting and strategic shopping. I pulled out the black dress and held it against myself in the mirror. It fit well enough, but it wasn't the kind of dress that commanded attention or respect. It was the kind of dress that helped you blend into the background. I was hanging it back up when my fingers brushed against something unfamiliar in the corner. A leather portfolio I hadn't touched in years, pushed behind winter coats and forgotten about. My father's initials were embossed in gold on the front. James Theodore Whitmore. I pulled it out, running my hand over the buttery leather surface. He'd carried this thing everywhere during his final years, treating it like it contained state secrets rather than business documents. Inside, I found the usual detritus of a man who'd built something from nothing. Stock certificates, board meeting minutes, legal correspondence. Most of it was dated from before I was born, back when Dad was still actively running his businesses instead of letting others manage them, while he focused on being present for Mom's illness and my childhood. I'd inherited everything when he passed 5 years ago, but I'd never paid much attention to the details. The lawyers had set up trusts and investments that generated enough income to supplement Daniel's salary without either of us having to think about it too much. I was about to close the portfolio when one document caught my eye. A stock transfer agreement dated just 2 months before Dad died. The company name made me pause. Cascade Tech Solutions. I read it again, certain I was misunderstanding something. But there it was, clear as day. My father had acquired a controlling interest in Daniel's company through a complicated series of investments and mergers I'd never bothered to understand. Which meant I owned Daniel's company. I owned the building where my husband worked 60-hour weeks trying to impress a boss who answered to me without knowing it. I sat down hard on the bedroom floor, the portfolio balanced on my knees. This changed everything. Or maybe it changed nothing. Daniel had no idea, and I wasn't sure I wanted him to know. He was proud of his work, proud of earning his position through talent and dedication rather than connections. Finding out his wife had accidentally owned his entire career trajectory would crush something fundamental in him. But Richard Blackwood. Richard, who'd been systematically undermining Daniel for 3 years. Richard, who'd passed him over for promotions in favor of less qualified candidates who happened to golf at the right country club. Richard, who'd made it clear that Daniel's middle-class background would always limit his advancement potential. Richard had no idea he'd been insulting the wrong person. I closed the portfolio and slid it back behind the winter coats. Tomorrow night would be interesting in ways I'd never anticipated. But first, I needed to figure out exactly what I wanted to do with this information. The smart move would be to say nothing, to let Daniel continue building his career on his own merits. The satisfying move would be to walk into that party knowing I held all the cards while everyone else played blindfolded. I chose satisfaction. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical Portland weather that matched my increasingly complicated mood. Tyler bounced around the kitchen in his school uniform, chattering about how cool it would be to see where Daddy worked, and whether they'd have good snacks at the grown-up party. His excitement was infectious and pure, untainted by the office politics and social hierarchies that made my stomach clench. "Mommy, will there be other kids there?" he asked, syrup from his waffles coating his chin. "A few," I said, wiping his face with a napkin. "But you'll need to use your best manners. This is Daddy's work, so everyone needs to see what a smart, polite boy you are." "Can I tell them about my rock collection?" I smiled despite my nerves. Tyler's rock collection was his current obsession, carefully arranged on shelves in his bedroom with handwritten labels describing where he'd found each specimen. To him, they were treasures worth sharing with anyone who'd listen. To the people we'd be meeting tonight, they'd probably seem like the quaint hobby of a child whose parents couldn't afford more sophisticated interests. "If they ask about your hobbies, absolutely," I said. "But remember to ask them questions too. People like talking about themselves." Daniel emerged from the bedroom looking harried, his hair still damp from the shower. "Victoria, have you seen my good cufflinks? The ones from our anniversary?" "Check the jewelry box on my dresser," I called, already knowing he wouldn't find them there. We'd sold those cufflinks 2 years ago, when Tyler needed emergency dental work and our insurance didn't cover the full amount. Daniel had forgotten, or maybe he'd convinced himself they were just misplaced rather than acknowledge we'd been that tight on money. "Never mind," he said a few minutes later. "The regular buttons are fine." He was nervous too, I realized. This party meant more to him than he was admitting, and that made my secret knowledge feel heavier. If I was going to tell him about the ownership situation, it should be now. Before we walked into a room where that information could change everything. Instead, I kissed his cheek and handed him his coffee in the travel mug Tyler had decorated with dinosaur stickers. "You're gonna do great tonight," I said. "Just be yourself." "Easy for you to say," he muttered, but he was smiling. "You don't have to worry about impressing anyone." If only he knew. The day passed slowly, each hour bringing us closer to an evening. I was equal parts dreading and anticipating. I spent most of it researching Cascade Tech Solutions online, trying to understand exactly what I'd inherited. The company was more successful than I'd realized, with contracts spanning multiple industries and a reputation for innovative logistics software. My father's investment had been shrewd, buying in during a period of expansion that had paid off handsomely over the years. I also researched Richard Blackwood. Georgetown MBA, 20 years in tech management, a reputation for aggressive growth strategies and cost-cutting measures that usually involve layoffs. His LinkedIn profile showed him speaking at conferences and accepting industry awards, always impeccably dressed and surrounded by other men in expensive suits. He looked like someone who'd never questioned whether he belonged anywhere. His wife Vanessa was easier to research because she documented her life extensively on social media: country club events, charity galas, shopping trips to Seattle and San Francisco. Their house in the West Hills was featured in Portland Monthly magazine as an example of, quote, modern luxury with traditional values. They had no children, and their lives appeared to revolve around networking events and status displays. These were the people who would judge Tyler's excitement about rocks and my off-the-rack dress. By 5 o'clock, I was ready to claim a sudden illness and stay home, but Tyler was already dressed in his best khakis and the button-down shirt we'd bought for his school's awards ceremony, his hair carefully combed and his face bright with anticipation. Daniel had pressed his suit and found a tie that made him look distinguished rather than desperate. We looked like a family that belonged somewhere, even if it wasn't the Pearl District Rooftop Club.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Ready? Daniel asked, jangling his keys nervously. I picked up my purse, checking to make sure I had Tyler's emergency inhaler and a few granola bars in case the party food wasn't kid-friendly. Then, on impulse, I grabbed my father's leather portfolio from the hall closet where I'd moved it that morning. What's that for? Daniel asked. Just some paperwork I need to review this weekend, I said, which wasn't technically a lie. I thought I might have a few quiet minutes to look it over. He shrugged, already focused on the evening ahead. We loaded into the Honda Civic, Tyler chattering from his booster seat about whether the building would have elevators and if he'd be able to see Mount Hood from the roof. His innocent excitement reminded me why we were doing this. Not for Richard Blackwood or his circle of executives, but for Daniel's career and our family's future. I just hadn't decided yet how much of that future I was willing to reveal tonight. The drive into downtown Portland took 40 minutes in Friday evening traffic, giving me plenty of time to second-guess every decision I'd made over the past 24 hours. Should I have told Daniel about the ownership documents? Should I have stayed home and avoided the whole situation? Should I have worn something more expensive, even if it meant putting the dress on a credit card we couldn't afford to pay off quickly? Instead, I watched the city skyline grow larger through the windshield and tried to imagine how the evening would unfold. Best case scenario: we'd make polite conversation, eat decent food, and leave early with Tyler none the wiser about the subtle hierarchies at play. Worst case scenario: Richard would make his disdain for our family so obvious that Tyler would notice, and I'd spend the rest of the weekend explaining why some adults weren't very nice to people they considered beneath them. I was so focused on managing my expectations that I almost missed Daniel's comment about parking. Valet service, he said, sounding impressed despite himself. I guess they really went all out for this thing. The Pearl District Rooftop Club occupied the top 3 floors of a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city below. A red carpet led from the curb to an elevator bank, and men in black uniforms were taking keys from arriving guests and driving away in cars that cost more than our annual income. This is so cool, Tyler whispered, pressing his face against the window as we pulled up behind a silver BMW. It's like a movie. Daniel handed our keys to a young man who looked politely puzzled by our Honda Civic but managed to smile anyway. Welcome to the Excellence Gala, he said, handing Daniel a ticket stub. The elevators to your right will take you directly to the main reception area. We stepped into the building's lobby, all marble floors and contemporary art installations that probably cost more than our house. Tyler's eyes were huge, taking in everything with the wonder of a child who'd never seen casual wealth displayed so openly. Daniel straightened his shoulders and took my hand, and together we walked toward whatever waited for us 23 floors above the street. The elevator was crowded with other couples, most of whom knew each other well enough to pick up conversations that had apparently started at previous events. I caught fragments about market conditions and acquisition rumors, stock options, and regulatory changes. Daniel listened intently, occasionally nodding as if he understood the context, but I could see the tension in his jaw. We weren't just entering a party. We were stepping into a world where we'd always be outsiders, where our carefully chosen outfits and practiced small talk would never quite measure up to the effortless sophistication of people who'd been born into this life. Or so they thought. The elevator doors opened onto a scene that took my breath away despite my determination not to be impressed. The main reception area was a wall of windows overlooking the Willamette River and the city beyond, the sunset painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Servers in crisp uniforms moved through clusters of guests carrying trays of champagne and appetizers that looked more like art than food. A string quartet played near the bar, their music mixing with the sound of laughter and conversation. Tyler's grip on my hand tightened, and I realized he was feeling as overwhelmed as I was. This wasn't just fancier than our usual experiences. It was a different universe entirely. "Daniel," a voice called from across the room. Richard Blackwood approached us with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. His wife Vanessa trailing behind him in a dress that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. "So glad you could make it. And this must be the family we've heard so much about." His tone was pleasant enough, but something in the way he looked at Tyler and me made it clear that what he'd heard hadn't necessarily been complimentary. Still, Daniel brightened at the attention from his boss, and I forced myself to smile as introductions were made. "Victoria, lovely to finally meet you," Richard said, shaking my hand with the kind of firm grip that was meant to establish dominance. "And Tyler, what a handsome young man. How old are you, son?" 8, Tyler replied, his voice smaller than usual. "I am in 3rd grade. 3rd grade, Richard exclaimed with the exaggerated enthusiasm adults use when they have no idea how to talk to children. "And what's your favorite subject?" "Science," Tyler said, gaining confidence. "We're learning about rocks and minerals. Did you know that obsidian is actually volcanic glass?" Vanessa's laugh was like breaking crystal. "Oh, how adorable. He's going to be a little rock hound. Very authentic." The word hung in the air like a judgment. Authentic, as opposed to sophisticated. Real, as opposed to refined. It was the kind of compliment that wasn't quite an insult, but made its message clear anyway. "Tyler loves learning about everything," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He's always asking questions and reading beyond what they cover in school." "How wonderful," Vanessa replied, already looking past us toward a couple who'd just arrived wearing clothes that were clearly more expensive than ours. "Richard, darling, the Hendersons are here. We should say hello." And just like that, we were dismissed. Daniel's face fell slightly, and I could see him calculating whether he'd said something wrong or if this was just how these events worked. Tyler looked confused but not hurt yet, still too caught up in the grandeur of the setting to process the subtle rejection. "Come on," I said, threading my arm through Daniel's. "Let's find that area they set up for kids." The children's section was tucked away in a smaller room adjacent to the main reception area, furnished with low tables and chairs, crayons and coloring books, and a television playing animated movies with the sound turned down low. 3 other children were already there, all slightly older than Tyler, all dressed in clothes that looked like they'd come from department stores I'd never shopped in. I settled Tyler at a table with some crayons and a coloring book featuring various dinosaurs, then returned to the main party to find Daniel standing alone near the windows, a glass of champagne in his hand, and an expression of determined cheerfulness on his face. "How's it going?" I asked, accepting a glass of wine from a passing server. "Great," he said, but I could hear the strain in his voice. Richard introduced me to a few people from the board. They seem interested in the Henderson project. I was about to respond when Vanessa Blackwood appeared beside us, as if summoned by the mention of business. "Oh, you're the engineer working on Henderson," she said to Daniel. "Richard was just telling us about some of the challenges with that project. Something about timeline delays?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "We're actually ahead of schedule on most deliverables. There were some scope changes early on that required us to rebuild certain components, but the client is very satisfied with our progress." Vanessa said, her tone suggesting she wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, I'm sure Richard knows what he's talking about. He has such high standards for his team." Her gaze shifted to me. "And Victoria, what do you do?" "Besides managing the household, of course." The question was innocent enough, but the way she asked it made it clear she expected the answer to be nothing of importance. I could have mentioned my bachelor's degree in business administration, or the consulting work I'd done before Tyler was born, or the nonprofit board I'd served on until last year. Instead, I found myself saying, I focus on supporting my family. It keeps me busy. I'm sure it does, Vanessa replied with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. It must be so rewarding to have such a traditional arrangement. Richard and I both have such demanding careers that we've never had time for children. But different choices work for different people, don't they? The subtext was clear. My life was small and old-fashioned compared to her modern sophistication. I was the kind of woman who made dinner and attended PTA meetings while she closed deals and attended board meetings. One of us was moving the world forward, and it wasn't me. It certainly works for us, I said, taking a sip of wine that tasted like it cost more per bottle than I usually spent on groceries in a week. And where did you two meet? Vanessa continued, clearly on a fact-finding mission. College sweethearts? Portland State, Daniel said, pride evident in his voice. Victoria was studying business, and I was in computer science. We met in a statistics class that was required for both our majors. Portland State, Vanessa repeated, and somehow managed to make it sound like we'd attended a community college rather than a respected public university. How nice. And you've been in Portland ever since? Born and raised, I said, deciding that admitting to local roots was better than trying to fabricate a more interesting personal history. How lovely to have such deep connections to the community, Vanessa said, and I was beginning to understand that everything she said was designed to establish our position in some invisible hierarchy she carried in her head. We were local, which meant unambitious. We were Portland State graduates, which meant adequate but not impressive. Daniel was an engineer, which meant technically competent but not executive material. And I was a stay-at-home mother, which meant I was basically invisible unless someone needed to be polite for professional reasons. Vanessa, darling. Richard's voice cut through our conversation as he joined our small circle. I was just telling the Hendersons about Daniel's work on the logistics platform. They're very interested in the cost-benefit analysis. Daniel straightened, clearly hoping this meant he'd get to discuss his project with potential clients. Instead, Richard continued talking to his wife, as if Daniel wasn't standing right there. The preliminary numbers are impressive, but we'll need to see how it scales before we can justify the development costs, Richard said. It's always a risk, investing in unproven technology. Unproven? Daniel interjected, his professional pride overriding his social caution. The platform has been tested extensively, and the client feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. Quote, Richard smiled the way adults smile when children interrupt grown-up conversations. Of course, Daniel, you've done excellent work on the technical side, but business decisions involve factors beyond pure engineering, as I'm sure you understand. The dismissal was so smooth that someone not paying attention might have missed it entirely. But I caught the way Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly, and the way Vanessa's smile became more genuine as she watched my husband realize he'd been put back in his place. I should check on Tyler, I said, needing to escape before I said something that would make Daniel's professional life even more complicated. I found my son contentedly coloring a picture of a triceratops, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. The other children had gravitated toward the television, but Tyler was absorbed in his artwork, carefully staying within the lines and adding details that weren't in the original drawing. How's it going, sweetheart? I asked, sitting down beside him. Good, he said without looking up. I'm making this one more realistic. Triceratops had really thick skin, kind of like an elephant, so I'm using the brown crayon instead of the green. That's very smart, I said, marveling at how he could find joy and learning opportunities, even in a corporate coloring book. Are the other kids nice? They're okay, Tyler said, finally glancing up. One of them said my shoes were weird, but I think he just hasn't seen Velcro ones before. His are the kind with laces, but they're really hard to tie. My heart clenched. Tyler's shoes were perfectly fine sneakers from Target, comfortable and practical and appropriate for an 8-year-old. But in this room full of children wearing designer clothes, they probably did look weird, to to someone who'd never had to consider whether spending $60 on shoes for a growing child was financially responsible. "Your shoes are perfect," I said firmly, "and very practical. That little boy probably wishes his shoes were as easy to put on as yours." Tyler nodded and returned to his coloring, unbothered by the criticism in the way that only confident children can be. But I knew that confidence was fragile, and that enough comments about his weird clothes or authentic interests could chip away at it over time. I was watching him add scales to his dinosaur when Daniel appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with what I hoped was excitement rather than embarrassment. "Victoria," he said quietly, "Richard wants to introduce me to some potential clients. Could you handle Tyler for a while longer?" "Of course," I said, noting the way his voice carried a mixture of hope and desperation. This was what he'd been waiting for, the chance to showcase his work to people who might actually appreciate it. "Great," he said, kissing the top of my head. "I'll try not to be too long." I watched him walk back toward the main reception area, his posture straighter than it had been all evening. Maybe this night would work out after all. Maybe Richard's earlier dismissiveness had been a test, and Daniel was finally going to get the recognition he deserved. Or maybe I was being naive about the way these things worked. I was still debating whether to feel optimistic or worried when Vanessa Blackwood appeared in the children's area doorway, a fresh glass of champagne in her hand and a speculative look on her face. "Victoria," she said, stepping into the room with the careful precision of someone who'd had just enough alcohol to feel bold but not enough to lose control. "I was hoping we could chat, woman to woman." Something in her tone made my stomach clench, but I smiled politely and followed her to a quieter corner of the room where Tyler couldn't overhear our conversation. "I wanted to talk to you about Daniel," she began, and my heart started beating faster. "Richard thinks very highly of his technical skills, but we're concerned about his trajectory within the company." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know. "Well," Vanessa said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "positions at Daniel's level require a certain amount of social finesse, client relationships, networking, the ability to represent the company at industry events. And frankly, we're not sure he has the background for that kind of role." I stared at her, trying to process what she was really saying. "Daniel graduated summa cum laude from Portland State. He's been promoted twice since he started at Cascade Tech. His project reviews are consistently outstanding." "Oh, absolutely," Vanessa said, waving her hand as if academic achievements were adorable but irrelevant. "But engineering excellence only takes you so far. Leadership requires a different skill set entirely. Cultural awareness, polish, the ability to move comfortably in professional social situations." She gestured vaguely toward the main reception area, where I could see Daniel engaged in animated conversation with a group of men in expensive suits. He looked confident and engaged, exactly like someone who belonged in that environment. "He seems to be doing fine tonight," I said carefully. Vanessa's smile turned pitying. "Oh, Victoria, you're sweet to think so. But I've been watching, and it's clear he's out of his depth. The way he interrupted Richard earlier, the questions he's asking the clients. It's obvious he doesn't understand how these relationships work." My hands were clenched so tightly around my wine glass that I was surprised it didn't shatter. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Vanessa said, her tone implying that she was doing me a tremendous favor by having this conversation. "I'm simply pointing out that Daniel might be happier in a more technical role. Senior engineer is a perfectly respectable position, and it would allow him to focus on what he does best without the pressure of trying to navigate executive responsibilities." Translation: Daniel was too middle-class, too earnest, too Portland State to ever be considered management material at Cascade Tech Solutions. And his wife was too ordinary, too traditional, too unimportant to be an asset in the kind of social climbing that apparently passed for business development in their world. "I think you might be underestimating him," I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "Perhaps," Vanessa said, clearly not believing it for a second. "But sometimes it takes an outside perspective to see these things clearly. I just thought you should know what you're both up against." She drifted back toward the main party, leaving me standing in the children's area with Tyler's cheerful coloring and the sound of animated movies and the burning certainty that this conversation had been a warning disguised as friendly advice. Daniel was never going to get that promotion. No matter how brilliant his work, no matter how dedicated his service, he would always be seen as technically competent, but socially inadequate. And by extension, I would always be seen as the kind of wife who held him back rather than helped him advance. Unless, of course, they learned who really owned the company they were all trying to climb. I walked back to Tyler's table and sat down beside him, pulling my father's leather portfolio onto my lap. Inside were documents that could change this entire evening, that could wipe the condescending smile off Vanessa Blackwood's face and make Richard reconsider every assumption he'd made about my husband's potential. But using them would also change everything for Daniel, and I wasn't sure I had the right to make that choice for him. Tyler looked up from his coloring. "Mommy, are you okay? You look kind of mad." I smiled at him, this beautiful, curious, authentic child who deserved to grow up believing that kindness and intelligence mattered more than social pedigree and designer shoes. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said. "Just thinking about some grown-up stuff. Is Daddy having fun at his work party?" I glanced toward the main reception area, where Daniel was still deep in conversation with potential clients, his face animated with the passion he felt for his work. He looked happy, engaged, hopeful about the future. He had no idea that future was being systematically limited by people who'd already decided he wasn't good enough for their inner circle. "Yes," I said, opening the portfolio and running my fingers over the stock certificates inside. "But I think the night is about to get much more interesting." I closed the portfolio with deliberate care, the leather making a soft whisper against itself that seemed to echo louder than the ambient party noise. Tyler was completely absorbed in adding what he called scientific accuracy to his dinosaur picture, using multiple shades of brown to create realistic skin texture. His concentration was absolute, the way children focus when the world makes sense to them. Unlike the adult world, where nothing was quite what it seemed. I stood up and smoothed my dress, checking my reflection in the darkened window that overlooked the city lights. The black fabric looked respectable enough in the dim lighting, and my hair had stayed in place despite the Portland humidity. I looked like a woman who belonged at a corporate event, even if everyone here seemed determined to convince me otherwise. The portfolio felt heavier in my hands than it should have, weighted with possibilities I hadn't fully considered. Knowledge was power, but only if you knew how to use it. And I was beginning to realize that 31 years of being polite and accommodating hadn't exactly prepared me for corporate warfare. "Tyler, sweetheart," I said, crouching down beside his chair. "I need to step out for a few minutes. Will you be okay here with the other kids?" He looked up, crayon poised mid-stroke. "Are you going to find Daddy?" "Something like that," I said, kissing his forehead. "I'll be right back. Stay at this table, okay?" "Okay, Mommy." "Can I show you my picture when you get back?" I figured out how to make the horns look more three-dimensional. "I can't wait to see it," I said, meaning every word. In a room full of people obsessed with status and appearances, my 8-year-old was the only one actually creating something beautiful. I walked back into the main reception area, the portfolio tucked under my arm like a shield I wasn't quite ready to draw. The party had shifted into a different gear during my absence. The initial networking phase was giving way to something more relaxed, with clusters of people settling into deeper conversations and the waitstaff circulating more frequently with refills. Daniel was still engaged with the same group of potential clients, but I could see the strain around his eyes. He was working too hard to impress them, leaning forward slightly when he spoke, and gesturing more broadly than usual. These were the unconscious adjustments people made when they sensed they weren't quite measuring up to expectations they couldn't fully identify. Richard stood at the center of a different group, holding court with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to be the most important person in any room. His voice carried over the ambient noise, rich with the kind of authority that came from years of having people hang on his every word. "The logistics industry is ripe for disruption," he was saying to a woman with silver hair and a designer handbag that probably cost more than our car. "But you need visionaries, leading the charge, not just technical implementers." Technical implementers. As if the people who actually built the innovations were somehow less valuable than those who took credit for them. I was considering whether to approach Daniel's group or find a neutral corner to observe. From when Vanessa appeared at my elbow again, her champagne glass refilled and her smile even more practiced than before. "Victoria," she said warmly, as if our earlier conversation had been a delightful chat between friends rather than a thinly veiled threat. "I was just telling Patricia Sinclair about you. Patricia, this is Victoria Hayes, Daniel's wife." The silver-haired woman turned toward me with polite interest. She was probably in her early 60s, with the kind of elegant posture that suggested decades of yoga classes and personal trainers. Her handshake was firm, and her eyes were sharper than her gracious smile indicated. "Patricia is on the board of directors at Cascade Tech," Vanessa continued, and I felt my heart skip a beat. "She's been instrumental in guiding the company's strategic direction." "How nice to meet you," I managed, acutely aware of the portfolio under my arm. If Patricia Sinclair was on the board, she would know exactly what the documents inside represented. The question was whether she knew who owned them. "Vanessa tells me your husband is working on the Henderson project," Patricia said. "That's been an interesting challenge for the development team." "Daniel enjoys complex problems," I replied carefully. "He's always been drawn to work that requires creative solutions." "Creativity is certainly valuable," Patricia said, her tone neutral enough that I couldn't tell if she meant it as a compliment or a polite dismissal. Though in my experience, the most successful projects require a balance of innovation and practical business sense. There it was again, the subtle implication that technical excellence wasn't enough. That people like Daniel, no matter how brilliant their work, would always be limited by their inability to navigate the unspoken rules of corporate hierarchy. "I couldn't agree more," I said, shifting the portfolio to my other arm, "though I've found that the best business decisions are usually informed by a deep understanding of the technical possibilities." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, as if she was surprised to hear me express an opinion about business strategy. "Do you have experience in the tech industry, Victoria?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could deflect with a modest comment about supporting Daniel's career, or I could stake a claim to my own knowledge and risk being seen as presumptuous. "Some," I said simply. "I studied business administration before Tyler was born, and I've always stayed involved in understanding the industries that affect our family's future." "How thoughtful," Vanessa said, her tone making it clear that she considered thoughtful to be a consolation prize for women who couldn't manage careers of their own. "It must be so nice to have that kind of intellectual hobby." Intellectual hobby. As if my education and interests were quaint diversions rather than legitimate qualifications for participating in conversations about business strategy. I was formulating a response when Daniel's voice cut through our small circle, slightly louder than it should have been and tinged with frustration. "That's not accurate," he was saying to someone in the client group. "The delays weren't caused by technical issues. They were the result of scope changes that weren't properly communicated to the development team." The three of us turned toward the commotion, and I could see Richard's face darkening as he moved toward Daniel's conversation. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going according to script. "Perhaps we should see what's going on," Patricia said mildly, but her eyes were alert with the kind of interest that suggested she was used to monitoring potential crises. We drifted closer to Daniel's group, close enough to hear the conversation, but not close enough to be obviously eavesdropping. Daniel was facing off with a man in his 50s who wore the kind of expensive suit that suggested he was used to having his word taken as law. "Mr. Hayes," the man was saying in the tone usually reserved for explaining things to children, "I'm simply relaying what we were told about the project timeline. If there were communication issues, that's something your team should have addressed internally." "Our team did address it," Daniel said, his professional composure beginning to fray around the edges. "We documented every scope change and submitted revised timelines that were approved by project management. The delays were built into the schedule from the beginning." Richard appeared beside the client with the smooth efficiency of someone used to handling damage control. "Gentlemen," he said with a practiced smile, "I think there might be some confusion about the project details. Daniel, why don't we let our guests enjoy their evening, and we can sort out these administrative questions on Monday." The dismissal was expertly done, managing to sound reasonable while making it clear that Daniel was being inappropriate by bringing up business specifics at a social event. Never mind that the client had brought up the delays first, or that Daniel was simply correcting misinformation about his own work. "Actually," Daniel said, his voice carrying the kind of edge that made my stomach clench, "I think it's important to address this now. Mr. Morrison seems to have been given incorrect information about our team's performance, and I'd like to set the record straight." The silence that followed was deafening. In a room full of people trained to avoid confrontation in social settings, Daniel's refusal to back down was like a fire alarm going off during a dinner party. Richard's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Of course, Daniel. But perhaps this conversation would be better suited to a conference room rather than a cocktail party." "Why?" Daniel asked, and I could see he was genuinely confused by the suggestion that defending his team's work was somehow inappropriate. "Mr. Morrison raised concerns about our project management in front of your other clients. Shouldn't those concerns be addressed publicly if they're going to be raised publicly?" Vanessa's hand found my arm, her fingers pressing just hard enough to be uncomfortable. "Your husband is very direct, isn't he?" she murmured, making it sound like a character flaw rather than a professional virtue. I watched Daniel standing alone in a circle of men who were all suddenly very interested in their drinks or the city view or anything other than the conversation that was spiraling out of control. He looked like exactly what he was, a brilliant engineer who'd walked into a political minefield without realizing the dangers. And Richard Blackwood was about to destroy him for it. "Daniel," Richard said, his voice taking on the firm tone of a parent correcting a misbehaving child, "I think you may have misunderstood the nature of Mr. Morrison's comments. He wasn't questioning your team's competence. He was simply noting that project timelines can be challenging in any complex development environment." It was a masterful reframe, simultaneously making Daniel's defense seem unnecessary and establishing Richard as the reasonable adult in the conversation. Mr. Morrison nodded approvingly, clearly relieved to have the conflict diffused in a way that didn't require him to admit any fault. But Daniel wasn't backing down. "Mr. Morrison specifically said that our delays were caused by poor project management. That's factually incorrect, and it reflects badly on my entire team." "I'm sure he didn't mean anything personal," Richard said, his patience beginning to sound strained. "Sometimes these technical details get lost in translation when we're discussing high-level strategy with clients." Technical details, lost in translation. As if Daniel's expertise was some kind of foreign language that needed to be interpreted for the real decision-makers. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest, watching my husband be systematically diminished by a man who wouldn't have a company to manage if my father hadn't made a series of strategic investments 20 years ago. "Richard," Daniel said, his voice carrying a note of desperation that made me want to run to his side, "you know the project documentation supports everything I'm saying. The client requested 17 major scope changes, and we accommodated every single one while maintaining the original quality standards. We deserve credit for that flexibility, not criticism for imaginary delays." The word "deserve" hung in the air like an accusation. In a room full of people who'd been handed opportunities based on family connections and social networks, the idea that merit alone should determine recognition was apparently naive to the point of being offensive. Richard's smile finally faltered, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an edge that cut through the party noise like a blade. "Daniel," he said quietly, "I think you've had a long week, and perhaps the stress is affecting your judgment. Why don't you take Victoria and your son home, and we'll discuss this properly when you've had a chance to reflect on tonight's conversation." The dismissal was so complete, so publicly humiliating, that I actually felt physical pain watching it happen. Daniel's face went white, then red, as he realized what had just occurred. He'd been sent home from a company party like a child who couldn't behave in public. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps I should clarify what I meant about the timeline issues." "That won't be necessary," Richard said smoothly. "I'm sure we can sort out any confusion next week. Daniel, thank you for coming tonight. I'll walk you to the elevator." It was over. Daniel's attempt to defend his work had been reframed as a social transgression, and now he was being escorted out of his own company's event. In a room full of his colleagues and potential clients, he'd been marked as someone who didn't understand the rules of professional behavior. Patricia Sinclair moved closer to me, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Your husband is very passionate about his work," she said carefully. "Yes," I replied, my own voice sounding strange in my ears. "He believes that good work should speak for itself." "An admirable philosophy," Patricia said. though not always practical in environments where relationship management is equally important. I turned to look at her, this elegant woman who served on the board of directors of a company she didn't realize I owned. What would you consider practical in this situation? She studied my face with the kind of attention that suggested she was reassessing her initial impressions. That would depend on what outcome you're hoping to achieve. Before I could respond, Vanessa reappeared at my side, her expression a carefully crafted mixture of sympathy and satisfaction. "Oh, Victoria," she said, reaching out to touch my arm again. "I'm so sorry this happened. Daniel is obviously very talented, but sometimes brilliant people struggle with the interpersonal aspects of corporate leadership." The sympathy was perfectly performed, complete with concerned eyebrows and a gentle tone that made her sound like she was delivering news of a minor tragedy, rather than celebrating the successful sabotage of my husband's career. "I should go find him," I said, clutching the portfolio tighter against my ribs. "Of course," Vanessa said. "And Victoria, don't take this too personally. These things happen in competitive environments. Daniel will land on his feet somewhere that's a better fit for his temperament." Translation: Daniel would never advance at Cascade Tech Solutions, and I should start preparing for him to find employment elsewhere, probably somewhere less prestigious, with less demanding clients and lower expectations for social sophistication. I started walking toward the elevator bank, my heels clicking against the polished floor with a rhythm that sounded like counting down to an explosion. Behind me, I could hear the party returning to its normal volume as people moved on from the evening's entertainment, because that's what Daniel's professional humiliation had been to them. Entertainment. I found Daniel and Tyler waiting by the elevators, Tyler chattering excitedly about something, while Daniel stared at the floor numbers with the hollow expression of someone trying to process public failure. His face was still flushed, and his hands were shoved deep in his pockets in a way that suggested he was fighting to maintain his composure in front of our son. "Hey," I said softly, reaching for his free hand. He looked up at me, and I could see the confusion and hurt warring with anger in his eyes. "I don't understand what just happened," he said quietly. I was correcting factual errors about my own project, and somehow that became inappropriate behavior. "Sometimes people don't want to hear facts," I said, which was true but insufficient. Tyler tugged on Daniel's jacket. "Daddy, can we go to the observation deck before we leave? I want to see if I can spot our house from up here." "Maybe next time, buddy," Daniel said, managing to smile for his son despite everything. "It's getting late, and we should head home." The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and we stepped inside along with two other couples who were also leaving early. The ride down was quiet, except for Tyler's continued commentary about the building's architecture and the impressive speed of the elevator system. I spent those 23 floors thinking about power and how it was wielded by people who'd never built anything but their own reputations. About my husband's faith in meritocracy running headfirst into a system designed to reward connections over competence. About my son's innocent excitement being slowly worn away by a world that would teach him to apologize for his enthusiasm. And about the documents in the portfolio under my arm that could change all of it. We retrieved our Honda Civic from the valet with minimal fanfare, Daniel tipping the young man who brought it around while I buckled Tyler into his booster seat. The drive home was mostly silent, Tyler falling asleep in the back while Daniel navigated the Friday night traffic with mechanical precision. It wasn't until we were on the freeway heading toward Beaverton that he finally spoke. "I should have handled that differently," he said, his voice tight with self-recrimination. "I let Morrison get under my skin, and then I made it worse by arguing with Richard in front of clients." "You were defending your team's work," I said. "That's not something you should apologize for." "But there's a time and a place for everything," Daniel said, echoing Richard's earlier dismissal. "I should have waited until Monday, handled it through proper channels." "What proper channels?" I asked. "The same channels that have been overlooking you for promotions despite your excellent performance reviews." Quote. Daniel glanced at me in surprise. "Victoria, that's not. The company has legitimate reasons for their personnel decisions. Such as experience, leadership potential, cultural fit, He was reciting someone else's words, probably Richard's. I'm still developing those competencies. Cultural fit. The euphemism that allowed companies to discriminate based on class background while pretending it was about professional qualifications. Daniel, I said carefully, what if I told you that your performance wasn't the problem? What if the issue was something else entirely? Like what? I looked back at Tyler, sleeping peacefully with his head tilted against the car seat, his mouth slightly open and his hands still faintly colored with crayon residue. He trusted us to navigate the adult world on his behalf, to make decisions that would protect his future and give him opportunities to use his curiosity and intelligence. Like the fact that people like Richard Blackwood have already decided that people like us don't belong in their inner circle, I said, and no amount of excellent work is going to change that. Daniel was quiet for several miles, processing this possibility. You think it's about money? Our background? I think it's about power, I said. And the people who have it don't like sharing it with people who earned their positions instead of inheriting them. So what are you suggesting? That I should just accept being passed over indefinitely? I reached into the back seat and pulled the portfolio into my lap, running my fingers over the smooth leather surface. I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to stop playing by their rules. What do you mean? Instead of answering, I opened the portfolio and pulled out one of the stock certificates, holding it so Daniel could see it without taking his eyes completely off the road. Daniel, I said quietly, we need to talk. He glanced at the document, then back at the road, then at the document again. Victoria, what is that? That's a stock certificate for Cascade Tech Solutions, I said. Issued to James Theodore Whitmore 22 years ago. Who's James Theodore Whitmore? My father, I said. And according to these documents, I inherited controlling interest in your company when he died. The car swerved slightly as Daniel processed this information, then steadied as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. That's impossible. I thought so too, I said, pulling out more documents. But it's all here. Purchase agreements, merger documentation, board appointment letters. My father acquired Cascade Tech through a series of investments in the early 2000s, and when he died, it all transferred to me. Daniel pulled off at the next exit and into a gas station parking lot, where he turned off the engine and sat staring at the documents I was spreading across the dashboard. You own my company, he said slowly, as if testing the words. Apparently. And you didn't know? I knew I inherited Dad's business interests, but I never paid attention to the details. The lawyers set up trusts and investment accounts, and I just assumed it was all boring financial stuff. Daniel picked up one of the stock certificates, examining it in the harsh light of the gas station. This says James Whitmore owns 62% of outstanding shares, which makes me the majority shareholder, I said. Which means Richard Blackwood works for me. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us trying to wrap our minds around the implications. In the back seat, Tyler stirred slightly but didn't wake up. Why didn't you tell me? Daniel finally asked. I just found out yesterday, I said. And honestly, I wasn't sure if I should tell you at all. Why not? Because I know how much your work means to you, I said. I know how proud you are of earning your positions based on merit. I was afraid that knowing about this would change how you felt about your career. Daniel leaned back against the headrest, closing his eyes. It changes everything. Does it have to? Victoria, I've been working for my wife's company for 3 years without knowing it. Every performance review, every project assignment, every promotion I didn't get. How do I know any of it was based on my actual work? Because you're brilliant at what you do, I said firmly. Because your code is elegant, and your project management is exceptional, and your clients consistently praise your work. None of that changes because of a piece of paper. Quote. But Richard's treatment of me tonight, Daniel said, opening his eyes. The way he dismissed my defense of the team, the way he sent me home like a disobedient child. If he knew who you were, would any of that have happened? I thought about Vanessa's condescending sympathy, about Patricia Sinclair's careful assessment, about the way everyone at that party had treated us like acceptable charity cases who should be grateful for the invitation. No, I said. It wouldn't have. So what do we do now? I gathered the documents back into the portfolio, my mind racing through possibilities I'd never imagined having to consider. I don't know, I said honestly, but I know that what happened tonight can't happen again. Not to you, and not to Tyler when he gets old enough to understand what he's seeing. Daniel started the car and pulled back onto the freeway, driving more slowly than usual as he processed our new reality. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the drive home, but I could feel something shifting between us, not just the knowledge of my unexpected ownership, but a shared understanding that we'd reached some kind of crossroads. The question was which direction we were going to choose. When we finally pulled into our driveway, Tyler woke up enough to stumble inside and fall back asleep on the couch without even taking off his shoes. Daniel and I stood in our kitchen, the portfolio open on the counter between us, like evidence of a crime we weren't sure we wanted to commit. "I need to think about this," Daniel said finally. "I know. And I need to figure out how I feel about everything that happened tonight." "That too." He headed toward our bedroom, then stopped in the doorway. "Victoria, thank you for telling me. I know it couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," I said. "But you deserve to know." After he left, I stood alone in the kitchen, with the documents spread across the counter, thinking about power and justice, and the difference between what people deserved and what they actually received. Tomorrow, Daniel would have to decide whether to return to work on Monday as Richard Blackwood's subordinate or as the husband of his boss. But tonight, I had my own decision to make. Because knowing I owned Cascade Tech Solutions was one thing. Deciding what to do with that knowledge was something else entirely. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Patricia Sinclair's contact information was listed in the company directory, which had been included in one of the trust documents. My finger hovered over the call button for several long minutes before I finally made my choice. The phone rang 3 times before she answered, her voice alert despite the late hour. "Patricia Sinclair. Miss Sinclair, this is Victoria Hayes. We met briefly at the party tonight." There was a pause, and I could hear the sound of her reassessing our earlier conversation in light of this unexpected call. "Victoria," she said carefully, "how can I help you?" "I was wondering if you might have time to meet with me early next week," I said. "I have some business matters I'd like to discuss." "What kind of business matters?" I looked down at the stock certificates spread across my kitchen counter, at my father's signature authorizing transactions that had shaped my family's future in ways I was only beginning to understand. "The kind that affect the strategic direction of Cascade Tech Solutions," I said. "I think it's time we had a conversation about corporate governance." Another pause, longer this time. "I see," Patricia said, and I could hear her mind working through the implications. "Would Monday morning work for you? Say 9 o'clock at my office?" "That would be perfect," I said. "Thank you for your time." "Victoria," she said before I could hang up, "should I expect anyone else at this meeting?" "Just me," I said. "At least initially. And should I prepare any specific materials?" I thought about Richard Blackwood's condescending smile, about Vanessa's dismissive assessment of my intellectual hobbies, about the way they'd both written off my family's potential before we'd even had a chance to prove ourselves. "Bring the current organizational chart," I said. "I think it's time to review our personnel decisions." Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Portland weather that made everything look washed out and uncertain. I dropped Tyler off at school with extra snacks in his backpack and a promise to pick him up early if his after-school program got canceled due to the storm that was supposed to move in later. He ran toward the building without looking back, his dinosaur backpack bouncing against his shoulders as he joined a group of friends discussing something animated near the playground equipment. Daniel had left for work an hour earlier than usual, claiming he wanted to get caught up on emails before the office filled up. We both knew he was avoiding the inevitable conversations about Friday night's party. Word would have spread by now about his confrontation with Morrison and Richard's public dismissal of his concerns. In the corporate world, that kind of spectacle became legend within hours. I sat in my car outside Lincoln Elementary for several minutes after Tyler disappeared through the front doors, watching other parents navigate the morning drop-off routine. Most of them looked like me, tired, practical, focused on the immediate logistics of getting children to school and themselves to work or back home to manage households. These were my people, the ones who understood that success was measured in small victories and careful budgeting rather than stock options and networking events. But this morning, I was driving to a different kind of meeting. Patricia Sinclair's law office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown Portland high-rise that I'd passed hundreds of times without ever imagining I'd have reason to go inside. The lobby was all polished marble and contemporary art installations, designed to make visitors feel either impressed or intimidated, depending on their reason for being there. The elevator ride-up felt longer than the 23 floors at the party venue, probably because I was traveling alone this time with nothing but a leather portfolio and a growing sense that I was about to step off a cliff. The law offices of Sinclair, Morrison & Associates looked exactly like what I'd expected from a firm that handled corporate governance for technology companies. Expensive furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River, and a reception area staffed by someone young and polished who looked like she'd stepped out of a business magazine spread about successful professionals. "Ms. Hayes," she said with a practiced smile, "Miss Sinclair is expecting you. Right this way, please." Patricia's office was corner real estate with views in two directions, the kind of space that announced its occupant's importance without being ostentatious about it. She stood up from behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of walnut, extending her hand in greeting as I entered. "Victoria," she said warmly, "thank you for coming in. Please, have a seat. Can I offer you coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be wonderful," I said, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Thank you for making time to see me on such short notice." "Not at all," Patricia said, pouring coffee from a service set that looked like actual silver rather than the stainless steel version most offices provided. "I have to admit, your call Friday night intrigued me. It's not often that spouses of employees request meetings to discuss corporate governance." She handed me a porcelain cup that felt substantial in my hands, the kind of weight that suggested quality rather than practicality. I took a sip and tasted coffee that was several levels above what I was used to, rich and complex with notes I couldn't identify but appreciated anyway. "I imagine it isn't," I said, setting the cup on the small table beside my chair and opening the portfolio on my lap. "But then again, most employees probably don't have spouses who own controlling interest in the company." Patricia's expression didn't change immediately, but I caught the slight pause as she processed this information. She was good at maintaining professional composure, but not quite good enough to hide her surprise completely. "I see," she said carefully. "And you're referring to which company specifically?" Instead of answering directly, I pulled out the stock certificates and laid them on her desk, arranged so she could read the company name and share percentages clearly. Patricia set down her own coffee cup and leaned forward to examine the documents, her trained eye taking in the details with professional efficiency. "These certificates show ownership of Cascade Tech Solutions shares issued to James Theodore Whitmore," she said after several moments. "Are you related to Mr. Whitmore?" "He was my father," I said. "And when he passed away 5 years ago, his estate was transferred to me according to the terms of his will." Patricia picked up one of the certificates, examining the signatures and official seals with the kind of attention lawyers pay to documents that could reshape everything. "According to these certificates, your father owns 62% of Cascade Tech Solutions at the time of his death, which would make me the majority shareholder," I said, proud that my voice remained steady despite my racing heartbeat. "Potentially," Patricia said, setting the certificate back on her desk. "Though I'd need to verify the chain of ownership and ensure all transfers were properly documented. May I ask why you're bringing this to my attention now?" I thought about Daniel's humiliation at the party, about Vanessa's condescending advice about his career limitations, about Tyler learning to apologize for his enthusiasms. "Because I think it's time I took a more active role in understanding how my investment is being managed." Patricia nodded slowly, and I could see her legal mind working through the implications. "Victoria, if these documents are authentic, and if the ownership transfers were properly executed, then you would indeed be the controlling shareholder of Cascade Tech Solutions. That would give you significant influence over corporate decisions, including personnel matters and strategic direction. Including the authority to make changes in company leadership?" "That would depend on the corporate charter and bylaws," Patricia said, But generally speaking, majority shareholders have considerable power to influence executive appointments and operational policies. I felt something settling in my chest, a kind of certainty I hadn't experienced in years. I'd like you to verify these documents and provide me with a complete analysis of my rights and responsibilities as majority shareholder. Of course, Patricia said. That's exactly the kind of due diligence we should complete before you make any decisions about how to proceed. She paused, studying my face with the kind of attention that suggested she was reassessing everything she thought she knew about me. May I ask what prompted this investigation? Did something specific happen that made you want to examine your father's investments? I thought about how much to tell her, how much context was necessary for her to understand the urgency I felt about resolving this situation. My husband works for Cascade Tech Solutions, I said finally, and I've become concerned about certain aspects of the company's management style. I see, Patricia said, and I could tell she was connecting dots between my presence at Friday's party and this Monday morning meeting. And your husband is aware of your potential ownership position? As of this weekend, yes. How does he feel about the situation? That was the question I'd been avoiding thinking about too directly. Daniel had been quiet and distant over the weekend, processing the revelation in his own way while I'd tried to give him space to work through his emotions. We'd managed the normal family routines, Saturday shopping, Tyler's soccer game, dinner at the neighborhood pizza place where we'd been going for 3 years, but underneath the ordinary surface, everything felt different. He's struggling with it, I said honestly. He spent his entire career believing that success should be based on merit rather than connections. Learning that his wife owns the company he works for has been difficult for him to accept. That's understandable, Patricia said. It changes the dynamic of his professional relationships significantly. Which is why I need to understand exactly what my options are, I said. I want to make decisions that protect his career while also ensuring that the company is being managed in ways that align with my values as an owner. Patricia made several notes on a legal pad, her handwriting precise and economical. What kind of timeline are you thinking about for this analysis? How quickly can you complete it? Given the complexity of corporate ownership verification, probably 2 to 3 weeks for a thorough review. I thought about Daniel facing another day of working for Richard Blackwood, about the way his shoulders had been set with resignation when he left for work that morning. Is there any way to expedite that process? Patricia looked up from her notes. Victoria, if you don't mind me asking, is there some urgency to this situation that I should be aware of? I set down my coffee cup and looked out at the city beyond her windows, at the buildings where people went to work every day believing that their efforts and talents would be fairly evaluated and rewarded. There was an incident at the company party Friday night, I said. My husband was publicly humiliated for defending his team's work, and it became clear that certain members of management have already decided he'll never advance within the organization regardless of his performance. That's unfortunate, Patricia said, but not uncommon in competitive corporate environments. Maybe not, I said, turning back to face her, but it's unacceptable in a company I own. The words hung in the air between us, and I realized I'd just articulated something I hadn't fully admitted to myself. This wasn't just about protecting Daniel's career or ensuring Tyler grew up seeing that merit mattered. This was about taking responsibility for an organization that was operating according to principles I fundamentally disagreed with. Patricia nodded slowly. I understand. Let me make some calls and see what I can do about accelerating the verification process. In the meantime, I'd recommend that you avoid taking any action that might alert current management to your potential ownership position. Why? Because if your ownership is confirmed, you'll want to have maximum flexibility in how you choose to exercise your authority. If Richard Blackwood and his team know what's coming, they'll have time to prepare defensive strategies or potentially take actions that could limit your options. That made sense, though it also meant Daniel would have to continue working in an environment where he was being systematically undermined. How long do you think I can maintain that kind of discretion? Ideally, until we have a complete legal analysis and you've decided how you want to proceed, Patricia said. Though if the management situation becomes untenable, we might need to accelerate the timeline. I gathered the stock certificates back into the portfolio, feeling the weight of decisions I wasn't quite ready to make. What would you do in my position? Patricia leaned back in her chair, considering the question with the kind of careful thought that suggested she didn't give casual advice about situations this complex. I'd want to understand exactly what I was inheriting before I decided how to manage it, she said finally. Your father built something significant with his investment in Cascade Tech Solutions. The question is whether the current leadership is stewarding that investment in ways that serve the company's long-term interests. And if they're not, then, as majority shareholder, you'd have both the authority and the responsibility to make changes. I stood up to leave, shaking hands with Patricia and promising to provide any additional documentation she might need for the verification process. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt different than the trip up, weighted with possibilities I was still learning to consider. My phone buzzed with a text message as I reached the parking garage. Daniel, checking in from work. How did your meeting go? I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to decide how much optimism was appropriate at this stage. Finally, I typed back. Promising. I'll fill you in tonight. The drive home took me through downtown Portland and past the building where Daniel spent his days writing code and attending meetings and trying to prove himself to people who'd already decided he wasn't worth their investment. I found myself looking up at the Cascade Tech Solutions sign on the 15th floor and thinking about all the decisions being made in conference rooms I'd never seen by people who didn't know they answered to me. That afternoon, I picked Tyler up from school and listened to his detailed report about the science experiment his class had conducted with vinegar and baking soda. His teacher had let him take the lead on explaining the chemical reaction to the other students, and his face glowed with the satisfaction of sharing knowledge with people who were genuinely interested in learning. Mrs. Patterson says I might want to think about entering the science fair this year, he said as we pulled into our driveway. She thinks I could do something really cool with geology specimens. That sounds wonderful, I said, meaning every word. What kind of project are you thinking about? Maybe something about how different minerals form under different conditions, Tyler said, his enthusiasm building as he talked through the possibilities, like how some crystals need high pressure, and others need specific temperatures. I could show how the same basic elements can create totally different structures depending on their environment. I paused in the middle of unbuckling my seatbelt, struck by the unexpected relevance of his observation. Different structures from the same basic elements, shaped by environmental conditions. It was a perfect metaphor for what was happening at Cascade Tech Solutions, where talented people like Daniel were being forced into rigid hierarchies that didn't allow them to reach their full potential. That's a brilliant idea, I said. And Mrs. Patterson is right. You could definitely do something really impressive with that concept. We spent the afternoon working on homework and preparing dinner, falling into the comfortable routines that had anchored our family life for years. But underneath the ordinary surface, I found myself thinking about corporate structures and environmental pressures, about the conditions that allowed some people to flourish, while others remained trapped in positions beneath their capabilities. When Daniel came home that evening, he looked tired in a way that went beyond the normal exhaustion of a long workday. He kissed me absently and ruffled Tyler's hair, but I could see the strain around his eyes and the way his shoulders carried tension he couldn't quite shake. How was work? I asked carefully, not wanting to push but needing to gauge how much the situation was affecting him. Quiet, Daniel said, which told me everything I needed to know. In an office environment, quiet usually meant people were avoiding you while they decided how to respond to whatever controversy had erupted over the weekend. Did you have a chance to talk to Richard? He was in meetings most of the day, Daniel said, which was probably true but also probably strategic. I'm sure we'll connect later this week. Tyler looked up from his homework, sensing the adult tension without understanding its source. Daddy, did something happen at your work party? You and Mommy have been acting weird since Friday. Daniel and I exchanged glances over our son's head, both of us realizing that our attempts to shield him from the situation hadn't been as successful as we'd hoped. Sometimes grown-ups have complicated problems to solve, Daniel said carefully. But nothing for you to worry about, buddy. Is it about your job? Are you going to have to find a new one? The question hit closer to home than Tyler could have known. Daniel sat down beside him at the kitchen table, and I could see him struggling to find words that were both honest and reassuring. I don't know yet, Daniel said finally. But whatever happens, we'll figure it out as a family. That's what families do. Tyler nodded solemnly, satisfied with this explanation in the way that children could be when adults acknowledged uncertainty without panic. He returned to his math worksheet, but I could tell he was still listening as Daniel and I moved our conversation to the living room. Patricia Sinclair is going to verify the ownership documentation, I said quietly, settling beside Daniel on the couch we'd bought when we first moved to this house. She thinks it will take 2 to 3 weeks for a complete analysis. And then what? Then I decide what I want to do with the information. Daniel was quiet for several minutes, staring at the coffee table where Tyler's rock collection was displayed in careful arrangements. Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay. If you do own controlling interest in Cascade Tech, are you planning to use that position to advance my career? The question caught me off guard, though I realized it shouldn't have. Daniel's professional integrity was one of the things I'd always admired most about him, and of course he'd be worried about compromising that integrity even inadvertently. I don't know, I said honestly. I haven't thought that far ahead. Because if you are, I need to know now, Daniel said. I need to decide whether I can continue working there if my career advancement is going to be based on my wife's ownership position rather than my own merits. I looked at my husband, this brilliant, principled man, who was struggling to reconcile his values with the reality of corporate politics. What if your career advancement has been limited not because of your performance, but because of biases that have nothing to do with your actual qualifications? Then that's something I'll have to find a way to address professionally. And if you can't, if the system is rigged against people like us, regardless of how hard we work or how well we perform. Daniel didn't answer immediately, and I could see him wrestling with possibilities he'd never wanted to consider. He'd built his identity around the belief that competence and dedication would eventually be rewarded, and questioning that fundamental assumption threatened something essential in his worldview. I need some time to think about this, he said finally. I know, I said, reaching for his hand. But Daniel, whatever I decide to do, it won't be about giving you anything you haven't earned. It'll be about making sure you have the opportunity to show what you're capable of. He squeezed my fingers, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something else. Instead, he stood up and headed toward the bedroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts and Tyler's careful arrangements of rocks and minerals. I sat there for a long time, thinking about structures and environments, about the conditions that allowed people to reach their full potential, and the obstacles that kept them trapped in positions beneath their capabilities. Tomorrow, Patricia would begin the process of verifying my ownership position. By the end of the month, I'd know exactly what authority I had to change the conditions at Cascade Tech Solutions. The question was whether I'd have the courage to use that authority when the time came. Tuesday morning brought clear skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that made Portland feel like the most beautiful city in the world. Tyler bounded out to the car wearing his favorite dinosaur shirt and carrying a bag of interesting rocks he'd collected over the weekend, eager to share his latest discoveries with Mrs. Patterson and his classmates. "Mommy," he said as I pulled out of our driveway, "do you think people always know when they're good at something?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Like, what if someone is really good at understanding rocks, but nobody ever asks them about rocks? How would they know they were smart about geology?" I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, struck once again by his ability to ask questions that cut straight to the heart of complex issues adults spent years trying to understand. "I think sometimes people need the right opportunities to discover what they're good at," I said carefully, "and sometimes they need other people to recognize their talents and give them chances to show what they can do. Like how Mrs. Patterson recognized that I know a lot about rocks and let me explain the different types to the class." "Exactly like that," I said, feeling a surge of gratitude for teachers who saw potential in children and created opportunities for them to flourish. So if someone is really smart but they never get the right opportunities, they might never find out how smart they are? Quote. "That's possible," I said, thinking about Daniel and all the other talented people whose careers were limited not by their abilities but by systemic barriers they couldn't control. Tyler was quiet for the rest of the drive, processing this information in the way children do when they're trying to understand how the world works. I watched him run into school with his bag of rocks and his boundless curiosity, and I made a silent promise that I would do everything in my power to make sure he grew up in a world that valued those qualities. My phone rang as I was pulling out of the school parking lot. Patricia Sinclair's name appeared on the caller ID, and I felt my heart rate spike as I answered. "Victoria," she said without preamble, "I've had my team working on your documentation since yesterday afternoon. Can you come in this morning? I have some preliminary findings I'd like to discuss with you." "How preliminary?" I asked, already turning the car toward downtown. "Preliminary enough that I think we should talk in person rather than over the phone." The drive to Patricia's office felt simultaneously endless and too short, traffic moving with the kind of sluggish unpredictability that made it impossible to estimate arrival times. I found myself rehearsing responses to various scenarios, good news, bad news, complicated news, that would require decisions I wasn't prepared to make. Patricia's assistant escorted me directly to her office this time, bypassing the usual pleasantries with an efficiency that suggested urgency. Patricia stood up from behind her desk as I entered, her expression professional but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been excitement. "Thank you for coming in so quickly," she said, gesturing for me to take the same chair I'd occupied during our previous meeting. "I have coffee ready, or I can offer you something stronger if you prefer." "Coffee is fine," I said, though my hands were already shaking slightly with anticipation. "What did you find?" Patricia poured coffee for both of us, then sat down across from me with a thick folder of documents. "Victoria, your ownership position is not only legitimate, it's more significant than either of us initially realized." She opened the folder and pulled out several pages of what looked like financial analysis. "Your father's investment in Cascade Tech Solutions wasn't just a single stock purchase. Over a period of 15 years, he systematically acquired shares through multiple transactions, including some that occurred during periods of financial difficulty for the company." "What does that mean, practically speaking?" "It means he was essentially functioning as a private investor who provided capital when the company needed it most," Patricia said. "And in return, he negotiated favorable terms that gave him increasing influence over corporate governance." She handed me a summary sheet that outlined the key findings. "According to the corporate charter and bylaws, your current ownership position gives you the authority to appoint and remove board members, approve or reject major strategic initiatives, and override management decisions you disagree with." I stared at the document, trying to process the scope of authority Patricia was describing. "I can override management decisions?" "Within certain legal parameters, yes. You have what amounts to veto power over any significant corporate action. And you can call for votes of no confidence in executive leadership if you believe they're not serving the company's interests." The coffee cup felt unsteady in my hands as I absorbed this information. "Patricia, are you telling me I can fire Richard Blackwood?" "I'm telling you that you have the authority to call for a board review of his performance and potentially recommend his removal if you can demonstrate that his leadership is detrimental to the company's long-term interests." I set down the coffee cup and leaned back in my chair, feeling overwhelmed by possibilities I'd never imagined having to consider. "What would that process look like?" Patricia pulled out another set of documents. "First, you'd need to formally establish your ownership position by registering with the corporate secretary and taking your seat on the board of directors. Your father apparently never chose to exercise his board privileges, preferring to remain a passive investor. Why would he do that? Based on the documentation, it appears he was focused on other business interests and viewed Cascade Tech as a long-term investment rather than an active management responsibility. He was content to let the company operate independently as long as it remained profitable." "And it has remained profitable?" "Extremely so," Patricia said, showing me financial reports that detailed the company's growth over the past 5 years. "Revenue has increased by an average of 18% annually, and the company's market position has strengthened significantly. By most measures, current management has been successful. But success can be measured in different ways," I said, thinking about Daniel's talent being wasted and other employees potentially facing similar barriers to advancement. "Absolutely," Patricia agreed. "Financial performance is just one metric. Corporate culture, employee satisfaction, ethical practices, and long-term sustainability are equally important considerations for responsible ownership." I studied the financial documents, trying to understand the full picture of what I was inheriting. If the company is performing well financially, would I be justified in making leadership changes based on management-style concerns? "That would depend on how you defined your responsibilities as majority shareholder," Patricia said carefully. Some owners focus primarily on return on investment. Others take a more comprehensive view that includes stakeholder welfare and corporate social responsibility. What would you recommend? Patricia was quiet for several moments, and I could see her weighing her words carefully. Victoria, you're inheriting significant power over an organization that employs nearly 200 people. Whatever decisions you make will affect not just your husband's career, but the livelihoods of everyone who works for Cascade Tech Solutions. I understand that. I think you do, Patricia said. Which is why I believe you should take time to fully understand the company's operations before making any major changes. Attend board meetings, review departmental reports, meet with key personnel. Make informed decisions based on comprehensive knowledge rather than personal grievances. It was good advice, and I knew she was right about the need for thorough analysis before taking action. But I also knew that Daniel was going to work every day in an environment that was slowly eroding his confidence and professional satisfaction. How long would that kind of comprehensive review take? Several months, probably. Maybe longer if you want to really understand all the operational aspects. I thought about Daniel's face when he'd come home the previous evening, about the quiet desperation I'd heard in his voice when he talked about finding ways to address professional bias through proper channels. Several months might be too long to wait. Patricia, I said, what if I told you that I had reason to believe current management was actively undermining talented employees for reasons unrelated to their job performance? I'd want to see documentation of that pattern of behavior, she said. Performance reviews, project reports, witness statements from other employees. The kind of evidence that would support your concerns if they were challenged. And if I could provide that documentation, then you'd have a much stronger case for exercising your authority as majority shareholder to implement changes in company leadership. I stood up to leave, my mind racing with the implications of everything Patricia had told me. How quickly can you help me establish my board position? I can have the paperwork filed by the end of the week, Patricia said. But Victoria, I want to make sure you understand what you're getting into. Once you take your seat on the board, your ownership position becomes a matter of corporate record. There's no going back to anonymity after that. I understand, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I understood all the ramifications of that choice. And your husband? How do you think he'll react when your ownership becomes public knowledge? That was the question I'd been avoiding thinking about too directly. Daniel was already struggling with the private knowledge of my ownership position. Learning that I'd decided to take an active role in company governance would force him to confront even more complex questions about his professional identity and career trajectory. I don't know, I said honestly. But I think it's time we both stopped pretending that staying quiet is going to protect us from the consequences of other people's decisions. Patricia walked me to the elevator, promising to call by the end of the week with the board registration paperwork. As the elevator descended toward the parking garage, I found myself thinking about Tyler's question from that morning, about people needing the right opportunities to discover their talents. Maybe it was time to create some of those opportunities, even if it meant disrupting a system that was working well for people who were already at the top. My phone buzzed with another text from Daniel as I reached my car. Richard wants to meet with me this afternoon. Not sure what it's about. I stared at the message, feeling a cold certainty settle in my stomach. After 3 days of avoiding the conversation, Richard was finally ready to address Friday night's incident, and I had a strong suspicion that the meeting wasn't going to go well for Daniel. I typed back quickly. Call me after the meeting. No matter what happens, we'll figure it out together. Then I drove home to wait, thinking about power and responsibility and the difference between the authority to change things and the wisdom to know when change was necessary. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, I'd know whether my husband still had a job. And by the end of the week, I'd know whether I was ready to use the power I'd inherited to ensure that talented people like Daniel had the opportunities they deserved. The waiting was almost over. Daniel's text came through at 4:37 while I was stirring pasta sauce and helping Tyler with his spelling homework at the kitchen counter. The message was brief. Meeting moved to tomorrow morning. Richard had to leave early for client dinner. I stared at the phone screen, feeling relief and anxiety in equal measure. Another night of uncertainty, but also another night to prepare for whatever was coming. Daniel would be home soon, and we'd have the evening to talk through everything that had happened in Patricia's office. Tyler looked up from his worksheet, pencil poised over a particularly challenging word. Mummy, how do you spell magnificent? Magnificent, I said, watching him carefully write each letter. What's the sentence you're using it in? The magnificent crystals formed deep underground over thousands of years. Tyler read aloud, his voice proud of the scientific accuracy he'd worked into his spelling assignment. That's perfect, I said, meaning it. Mrs. Patterson is going to be impressed with how you incorporated your geology knowledge. Tyler beamed and returned to his work, completely absorbed in creating sentences that showcased both his spelling skills and his passion for earth sciences. I envied his ability to find joy in learning for its own sake, uncomplicated by office politics or professional hierarchies. Daniel arrived home 20 minutes later, looking tired but less tense than he'd been that morning. He kissed me hello and settled at the kitchen table with Tyler, helping him finish the spelling homework while I plated dinner. How was your day? I asked as we sat down to eat, trying to keep my tone casual despite everything I was dying to tell him about my meeting with Patricia. Productive, Daniel said, cutting Tyler's chicken into smaller pieces. I made good progress on the Morrison account documentation, and I had a useful conversation with Sarah Chen about the upcoming deployment schedule. Did you see Richard at all? Briefly, in the hallway. He just said he was looking forward to our meeting tomorrow, and that he wanted to discuss some opportunities for my professional development. I nearly choked on my pasta. Professional development was corporate speak for either promotion or termination, and given the context of Friday night's events, I had a strong suspicion which direction Richard was leaning. That sounds promising, I managed, hoping my voice conveyed more optimism than I felt. Maybe, Daniel said, but I could hear the uncertainty underneath his careful neutrality. We'll see what he has in mind. Tyler launched into a detailed report about his school day, describing a playground disagreement that had been resolved through what he called scientific negotiation, which apparently involved both parties presenting evidence for their positions and reaching a compromise based on observable facts. Daniel and I listened with the kind of attention that 8-year-old stories deserved, but I could see we were both distracted by larger concerns. After Tyler was settled in the living room with his homework finished and a nature documentary queued up on the television, Daniel and I retreated to the kitchen for the conversation we'd been postponing all day. How did your meeting go with Patricia? He asked, settling into his chair with a cup of coffee that was probably too late in the day but necessary given the circumstances. It was enlightening, I said, pulling out the folder of documents Patricia had given me to review. Daniel, my ownership position is much more significant than we initially realized. I walked him through the key findings from Patricia's analysis, watching his expression change as he absorbed the full implications of what I was telling him. By the time I finished explaining the scope of my authority as majority shareholder, Daniel was staring at the financial reports with the kind of stunned silence that suggested he was still processing the information. You can fire Richard, he said finally, his voice flat with disbelief. I can call for a board review of his performance and potentially recommend his removal. I corrected. But yes, essentially. Daniel pushed back from the table and walked to the window, overlooking our backyard, where the automatic sprinkler system was watering the small vegetable garden we'd planted with Tyler that spring. Victoria, do you understand what this means? I think so. It means I've been working for my wife's company for 3 years without knowing it, Daniel said, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and embarrassment that made my chest tight. It means every performance review, every project assignment, every interaction with management has been happening under false pretenses. That's not true, I said firmly. Your work stands on its own merit. The quality of your code, your project management skills, your client relationships, none of that is diminished by something you didn't even know about. But my career trajectory is, Daniel said, turning back to face me. If Richard knew who you were, do you think he would have treated me the way he did Friday night? Do you think he would have dismissed my concerns in front of clients if he knew I was married to the majority shareholder? I didn't answer immediately, because we both knew the response to that question. Richard Blackwood was exactly the kind of man who would adjust his behavior based on perceived power dynamics rather than actual merit. No, I said quietly. He wouldn't have. So what does that tell us about the 3 years I've spent trying to earn his respect through excellent work performance? Daniel was pacing now, working through emotions I couldn't fully understand because I'd never built my identity around professional achievement the way he had. His career wasn't just how he made money, it was how he measured his worth as a person. It tells us that the system is broken, I said. It tells us that people like Richard make decisions based on social connections and perceived status rather than actual competence. And now you want to use your social connection to fix my career? I want to use my legal authority to ensure that talented people get the opportunities they deserve, I said, choosing my words carefully. Not just you. Everyone who works for that company. Daniel stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Victoria, what exactly are you planning to do? I thought about Patricia's advice to take time for comprehensive analysis before making major changes. I thought about the responsibility I had to nearly 200 employees whose livelihoods could be affected by my decisions. I thought about Tyler's question about people needing the right opportunities to discover their talents. I don't know yet, I said honestly. But I know I can't just sit on this information and pretend it doesn't exist. Even if it means fundamentally changing the nature of my professional relationships? Even if it means creating a workplace where your professional relationships are based on mutual respect rather than arbitrary hierarchy. Daniel was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the garden where tomatoes were ripening on the vine and basil plants were growing with the kind of vigorous health that came from proper care and attention. I need to think about this, he said finally. I know. And I need to get through tomorrow's meeting with Richard before we make any decisions about how to proceed. Of course. He walked back to the table and gathered up the documents Patricia had given me, studying them with the same careful attention he brought to complex coding problems. Victoria, if you decide to reveal your ownership position, it changes everything for both of us. I understand that. I mean everything, Daniel emphasized. Our marriage, our family dynamics, how Tyler grows up understanding success and failure. We stop being a middle-class family working our way up through merit and hard work. We become people with inherited power and the ability to influence other people's careers. I hadn't thought about it in quite those terms, but he was right. Taking active control of Cascade Tech Solutions wouldn't just change Daniel's professional life. It would change who we were as people and as a family. Is that necessarily a bad thing? I asked. I don't know, Daniel said, but it's a permanent thing. Once people know you own the company, they'll never treat either of us the same way again. Every conversation, every professional relationship, every social interaction will be filtered through that knowledge. And staying silent means letting Richard continue to limit your career based on biases that have nothing to do with your actual performance. Daniel nodded slowly, acknowledging the impossible position we found ourselves in. So what do you want to do? I looked through the kitchen doorway toward the living room, where Tyler was completely absorbed in a documentary about volcanic rock formations. He was taking notes in a small spiral notebook, occasionally pausing the show to draw diagrams of different crystal structures. His concentration was absolute, his curiosity boundless, his faith in the power of knowledge and learning unshaken by adult cynicism. I want to make sure he grows up in a world where that kind of passion and intelligence is recognized and rewarded, I said. I want him to believe that working hard and caring about quality will lead to opportunities to do even better work. Even if it means using power and privilege to create those opportunities? Even if it means using power and privilege to remove the barriers that prevent merit from being recognized. Daniel set the documents back on the table and reached for my hand. Whatever we decide together. This affects both of us, and Tyler too. Agreed, I said, squeezing his fingers. But Daniel, I need you to know that I'm not going to be able to stay quiet much longer. Not after Friday night, and not after learning what I learned today. How much longer? I thought about Richard's meeting with Daniel the next morning, about the professional development opportunities that were probably designed to push him even further from advancement potential. After tomorrow's meeting, I think we'll know what we're dealing with. And if the meeting goes badly, quote, then we stop pretending that playing by their rules is going to lead to fair treatment. Daniel nodded, understanding the ultimatum implicit in my words. Tomorrow would determine whether Richard Blackwood was willing to treat talented employees with the respect they deserved, or whether he would continue operating according to the kind of arbitrary bias that had shaped Daniel's career for the past 3 years. We spent the rest of the evening helping Tyler with a science project about mineral hardness, watching him carefully test different specimens with tools we'd improvised from household items. His methodical approach to gathering data and drawing conclusions reminded me of everything I admired about Daniel's professional approach to problem solving. By the time Tyler was in bed and Daniel and I were finishing the dishes, we'd reached an unspoken agreement about the next day. We would wait to see what Richard had to say in his meeting with Daniel. We would evaluate his professional development opportunities in the context of everything else we knew about his management style. And then we would decide whether it was time to stop being passive recipients of other people's decisions about our family's future. "Victoria," Daniel said as we were turning off the kitchen lights, "whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I'm grateful you told me about the ownership situation. It would have been easier for you to handle this on your own." "We're partners," I said simply, "in everything. Even in corporate governance?" I smiled, thinking about the stack of board registration paperwork Patricia would be filing by the end of the week, especially in corporate governance. The next morning arrived with the kind of unseasonably warm weather that made Portland feel like a different city entirely. Tyler bounded out of bed, talking about whether the warm air might affect the metamorphic rock samples he was planning to collect after school, and Daniel moved through his morning routine with the careful precision of someone preparing for a potentially life-changing conversation. I dropped Tyler at school and watched him join a group of friends who were examining something fascinating in the playground mulch, their heads bent together in the kind of collaborative investigation that reminded me why I wanted to protect environments where curiosity was valued over conformity. "Mrs. Hayes?" A voice called as I was walking back to my car. I turned to see Mrs. Patterson, Tyler's teacher, approaching with a folder in her hands and a warm smile on her face. "I'm so glad I caught you," she said. "I wanted to talk to you about Tyler's science fair proposal. He submitted some really impressive preliminary research about crystal formation processes." Quote, "He's very passionate about geology," I said, feeling the familiar surge of pride that came with discussing Tyler's academic interests. "It shows," Mrs. Patterson said, "but what really impressed me was his hypothesis about how environmental conditions affect structural development. He's thinking about these concepts in ways that are quite sophisticated for his age." She handed me the folder, which contained Tyler's handwritten proposal complete with diagrams and a bibliography of sources he'd consulted independently. "I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to help him access some additional research materials," Mrs. Patterson continued. "There are some excellent resources at the Portland State Geology Department that might be appropriate for his project level." Portland State, where Daniel and I had met, where we'd both learned to believe that education and hard work would create opportunities for advancement. Where professors like Dr. Martinez had encouraged students to think beyond the limitations of their backgrounds and pursue careers that matched their abilities rather than their social connections. "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said, meaning every word. "Tyler would be thrilled to have access to real scientific resources." "Perfect," Mrs. Patterson said. "I'll send home some contact information this afternoon. And Mrs. Hayes, you should be very proud. Tyler's approach to learning is exactly what we hope to see in students who are going to make real contributions to scientific understanding." I drove home thinking about contributions to scientific understanding, about environments that nurtured curiosity rather than stifling it, about the difference between institutions that valued merit and those that valued conformity. By the time I reached our house, I'd made a decision about how to spend the hours until Daniel's meeting with Richard. I called Patricia Sinclair. "Victoria," she said, answering on the second ring, "how can I help you?" "I want to accelerate the board registration process," I said. "How quickly can you make it happen?" There was a pause while Patricia processed this request. "May I ask, what's prompted this urgency?" "My husband is meeting with Richard Blackwood this morning to discuss his professional development opportunities," I said. "I have a feeling that conversation is going to clarify exactly what kind of leadership changes Cascade Tech Solutions needs." "I see," Patricia said, and I could hear her making notes. "I can have the paperwork filed by this afternoon if you're certain you want to proceed." "I'm certain." "Victoria, once you're registered as an active board member, your ownership position becomes part of the corporate record. Richard and the rest of the management team will know about your authority within 24 hours. "Good," I said, surprising myself with how calm I felt about that prospect. It's time they understood exactly who they're accountable to. "And your husband? How do you think he'll react when he learns that you've taken this step?" I thought about Daniel's face when he'd talked about wanting Tyler to grow up believing that merit mattered, about his frustration with playing by rules that seemed designed to limit rather than reward excellent work. "I think he'll understand that some things are more important than maintaining the status quo," I said. Patricia promised to call as soon as the registration was complete, and I spent the rest of the morning researching Cascade Tech Solutions in ways I'd never bothered to before. Financial reports, employee reviews, industry analysis, competitor assessments. I wanted to understand exactly what I was inheriting before I started making decisions about how to manage it. What I found was both encouraging and troubling. The company was indeed financially successful, with strong growth metrics and an impressive client retention rate. But employee satisfaction surveys told a different story. High turnover in mid-level management positions, complaints about unclear advancement criteria, and consistent feedback about communication problems between senior leadership and development teams. People were leaving Cascade Tech not because the company was unsuccessful, but because they couldn't see paths for professional growth that weren't dependent on politics rather than performance. Talented employees were finding opportunities elsewhere because they'd given up on being recognized for their contributions. It was exactly the kind of systemic problem that could be addressed by ownership that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term convenience. My phone rang at 11:15. Daniel's name appeared on the caller ID, and I felt my heart rate spike as I answered. "How did it go?" I asked without preamble. "Can you meet me for lunch?" Daniel's voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear something underneath that might have been anger, or might have been relief. "There's a lot to talk about." "Of course. Where do you want to meet?" "That place on Hawthorne where we had our first date," Daniel said. "I think we need to revisit some fundamental assumptions about our future." I arrived at the small cafe 15 minutes before our agreed meeting time, securing a corner table that would give us privacy for whatever conversation Daniel needed to have. The lunch crowd was just beginning to gather, but the morning regulars were still lingering over coffee and laptops, creating the kind of ambient noise that would mask serious discussions. Daniel walked through the door at exactly 12 o'clock, his expression unreadable, but his posture suggesting that the morning's meeting had not gone according to Richard's plans. He ordered coffee and a sandwich, then sat down across from me with the deliberate movements of someone who was choosing his words carefully. "Richard offered me a lateral transfer to the maintenance division," he said without preamble. "Same salary, same title, but essentially removing me from any client-facing work or strategic project involvement." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What reason did he give? He said that Friday night's incident raised concerns about my judgment in professional social situations, Daniel said, his voice steady but his eyes bright with suppressed fury. He suggested that I might be more comfortable in a role that didn't require as much interpersonal finesse. "And what did you tell him?" Daniel's smile was sharp, with the kind of controlled anger that came from years of swallowing professional humiliation. "I told him I needed to discuss it with my family before making any decisions about my career trajectory." "How did he respond to that?" "He said that was fine, but that he'd need an answer by the end of the week because the maintenance position was only available for a limited time." I stared at my husband, this brilliant man who had just been offered a choice between professional exile and unemployment, all because he'd had the audacity to defend his team's work in front of clients who deserved accurate information. "Daniel," I said quietly, "are you ready to stop playing by their rules?" He reached across the table and took my hand, his grip firm with the kind of certainty that came from finally seeing a situation clearly. "Victoria," he said, "I'm ready to find out what happens when they have to play by ours." I pulled out my phone and called Patricia Sinclair, putting the call on speaker so Daniel could hear both sides of the conversation. "Patricia," I said when she answered, "please file that board registration paperwork immediately." Consider it done, Patricia said. Should I also prepare documentation for a special board meeting to review current management performance? I looked at Daniel, who nodded with the kind of quiet determination I'd fallen in love with 12 years earlier. Yes, I said. I think it's time for Cascade Tech Solutions to have some conversations about leadership accountability and professional development opportunities. I'll have everything ready by tomorrow afternoon, Patricia said. Victoria, are you prepared for the kind of attention this is going to generate? I thought about Tyler's passionate curiosity about crystal formations, about Mrs. Patterson's recognition of his scientific potential, about all the talented people whose contributions were being overlooked because they didn't fit someone else's definition of leadership material. I'm prepared to ensure that merit gets recognized and rewarded, I said. Whatever attention that generates, we'll handle it. After ending the call, Daniel and I sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both of us processing the magnitude of the decision we'd just made. By tomorrow evening, Richard Blackwood would know exactly who he'd been underestimating. By the end of the week, the entire leadership structure at Cascade Tech Solutions would understand that their authority derived from the trust of people who expected them to earn that trust through competent, ethical management. Victoria, Daniel said finally, what do you think Tyler is going to make of all this? I smiled, thinking about our son's methodical approach to understanding how different environmental conditions created different structural possibilities. I think he's going to find it fascinating, I said. After all, we're just changing the environmental conditions to see what kind of structures develop naturally. And if the current management doesn't adapt well to the new environment, then they'll discover what happens when natural selection applies to corporate leadership, I said, just like in Tyler's geology studies. Some formations are stable under changing conditions, and some aren't. Daniel laughed, and for the first time in weeks, it sounded genuinely relaxed. I love it when you use scientific metaphors to describe corporate warfare. It's not warfare, I corrected. It's ecosystem management. We're just making sure the most adaptive and beneficial species have the resources they need to flourish. And the species that can't adapt to merit-based environments? I thought about Richard Blackwood's condescending dismissal of Daniel's expertise, about Vanessa's casual cruelty toward Tyler's enthusiasm, about all the ways they'd made it clear that people like us would never be considered truly worthy of respect. They'll find new environments that are better suited to their particular survival strategies, I said. Or they'll learn to adapt. Either way, they won't be limiting other people's potential anymore. By the time we left the cafe, the afternoon sun was warm on our faces, and the future felt full of possibilities we'd never dared to imagine. Tomorrow, Richard Blackwood would learn that the quiet woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant decoration actually owned the company he'd been running as his personal kingdom. And by the end of the week, Cascade Tech Solutions would have a very different understanding of what professional development opportunities actually looked like. Patricia's call came through at 2:30 Thursday afternoon while I was reorganizing Tyler's rock collection according to his new classification system based on hardness and crystal structure. The registration paperwork had been filed, and I was now officially listed as the majority shareholder and newest board member of Cascade Tech Solutions. It's done, Patricia said without preamble. Corporate records will be updated by close of business today. By tomorrow morning, Richard Blackwood will receive notification that there's been a change in board composition. How much detail will he get initially? Just that Victoria Hayes has been appointed to fill a previously vacant board position, and that a special meeting has been called for Monday morning to review current operational strategies. I felt a flutter of nerves mixed with anticipation. Will he know about my ownership percentage? Not immediately, Patricia said. That information requires a formal records request, but he'll have it by Monday if he's smart enough to ask the right questions. And if he isn't? Then Monday's meeting will be quite educational for everyone involved. After hanging up, I sat surrounded by Tyler's carefully organized mineral specimens, thinking about the crystalline structures that formed under pressure over thousands of years. Some rocks cracked under stress, while others transformed into something stronger and more beautiful. By Monday, we'd discover which category the current leadership of Cascade Tech Solutions belonged to. Daniel arrived home that evening with groceries and the distracted air of someone who'd spent the day making complex calculations about an uncertain future. Tyler immediately launched into a detailed explanation of his new rock classification system, demonstrating how different minerals exhibited different properties under identical testing conditions. "See, Daddy? This one looks really strong, but when you test it with the penny, it scratches super easily. But this other one that looks kind of plain is actually way harder. You can't judge them just by looking." Daniel examined the samples with genuine interest, asking questions about Tyler's methodology and praising his systematic approach to data collection. But I could see the metaphorical weight of our son's observations settling over him like a revelation. "That's very smart, buddy," Daniel said. "Sometimes the most valuable things aren't the ones that look impressive at first glance." "Exactly," Tyler said, warming to his theme. "Mrs. Patterson says that's why scientists have to do actual experiments instead of just guessing. Appearances can be really misleading." After Tyler was absorbed in his homework, Daniel and I retreated to the back porch with cups of coffee and the comfortable silence that came from sharing a secret that would reshape everything by Monday morning. "I've been thinking about the transfer offer," Daniel said eventually, staring out at the garden where evening shadows were lengthening across the tomato plants. "And I think I'm going to tell Richard tomorrow that I need to decline." "Are you sure?" Daniel turned to look at me, and I could see something had solidified in his expression over the course of the day. "Victoria, I've spent 3 years trying to prove myself to someone who was never going to give me credit for my work. I'm not going to spend the next 3 years accepting a demotion just to keep a job that doesn't value what I bring to it. Even if it means being unemployed?" "Even if it means being unemployed," Daniel said firmly. "I'd rather bet on my abilities in a new environment than accept Richard's assessment of my limitations." I reached for his hand, feeling proud of this man who chose indignity over security, even when he thought he had no other options. "For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. Win or lose?" Win or lose. We spent Friday morning in our normal routine, dropping Tyler at school and exchanging the usual pleasantries about weekend plans and upcoming school events. But underneath the ordinary surface, both Daniel and I moved with the heightened awareness that came from knowing everything was about to change. Daniel left for work, carrying a brief resignation letter in his jacket pocket, prepared to hand it to Richard rather than accept the maintenance division transfer. I spent the morning researching corporate governance procedures and reviewing employee files Patricia had requested from the company's HR database. What I found confirmed everything Daniel had experienced personally. A pattern of talented employees being passed over for advancement in favor of less qualified candidates who fit Richard's preferred demographic profile. Performance reviews that consistently rated technical competence highly while finding subjective reasons to question leadership potential. Exit interviews that cited, quote, cultural fit concerns and, quote, communication style issues that seemed to correlate more with educational background and social class than actual job performance. It was systematic discrimination dressed up in corporate euphemisms, and it had been affecting far more people than just my husband. Daniel's text came through at 3:15. Conversation with Richard postponed until Monday. He's been in meetings all day with the board secretary and corporate legal. I stared at the message, understanding immediately what this delay meant. Richard had received notification of the board changes and was scrambling to understand what they signified for his position. He was smart enough to recognize that unexpected board appointments usually preceded significant organizational changes, and he was using the weekend to prepare for whatever was coming, which gave us the weekend to prepare as well. Saturday morning brought unseasonably perfect weather, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the Pacific Northwest feel like paradise. Tyler had a soccer game at 10, followed by plans to collect rock samples from a new location his geology club had recommended. Normal family activities that felt both precious and surreal, given what was scheduled to happen Monday morning. I watched my son run across the soccer field with the same methodical determination he brought to his scientific investigations, never the fastest player, but always thinking strategically about positioning and teamwork. His coach had learned to value Tyler's analytical approach to the game, often asking him to explain defensive formations to younger players who could benefit from his systematic thinking. "He's got natural leadership qualities," another parent commented, settling beside me on the sideline bleachers. My daughter says Tyler's the one who helped her understand the offside rule by drawing diagrams during practice. He likes solving problems, I said, feeling the familiar surge of pride that came with watching Tyler share his knowledge in ways that helped others learn. That's a valuable skill, the parent said. Kids who can break down complex concepts and explain them clearly usually do well in whatever field they choose. I thought about corporate environments where analytical thinking was valued only when it came from people who fit predetermined leadership profiles, where Tyler's natural talents might be overlooked or undervalued based on factors completely unrelated to his actual capabilities. Not if I had anything to say about it. After the game, we drove to a creek bed in the Mount Hood foothills, where Tyler hoped to find examples of metamorphic rock formations. Daniel and I sat on a fallen log while Tyler worked his way systematically along the water's edge, examining specimens with the magnifying glass and hardness testing kit he'd assembled from birthday and allowance money. "Mommy, look at this," Tyler called, holding up a piece of stone that looked unremarkable to my untrained eye. This started out as regular sedimentary rock, but you can see where heat and pressure changed its structure. It's way stronger now than it was originally. "That's fascinating," Daniel said, examining the specimen Tyler handed him. "So the same basic materials became something completely different because of environmental changes?" "Right," Tyler said, his enthusiasm building as he explained the geological processes. "And the best part is, the new structure is usually more stable and durable than what was there before. The pressure doesn't weaken, it makes it better." Daniel and I exchanged glances over Tyler's head, both of us thinking about transformations and environmental pressures and structures that became stronger rather than weaker when subjected to stress. Sunday passed quietly, with Daniel working on a freelance coding project he'd taken on months earlier, and me reviewing the corporate governance materials Patricia had prepared for Monday's board meeting. By evening, we'd both reached a state of calm readiness that felt remarkably similar to the night before Tyler was born, a mixture of anticipation and certainty that whatever happened next, we were prepared to handle it together. "Victoria," Daniel said as we were turning off the lights for bed, "whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I'm proud of what we're doing. Even if it means people will always wonder whether your career success is based on your talents or your wife's ownership position. Especially because it means people will have to evaluate my actual work instead of dismissing it, based on their preconceptions about who deserves opportunities." Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Portland weather that somehow felt appropriate for the kind of serious business that lay ahead. I dropped Tyler at school with extra hugs and promises to pick him up early if his after-school program was canceled due to the weather that was supposed to intensify throughout the day. Daniel left for work with his usual laptop bag and travel coffee mug, but also with a crisp envelope containing his formal response to Richard's transfer offer. If the morning went according to plan, he wouldn't need to deliver it. If things went differently than we hoped, he was prepared to maintain his professional dignity regardless of the personal cost. I arrived at Patricia's office at 8:30 for our final preparation meeting before the special board session scheduled for 10 o'clock. She had coffee ready and a conference table covered with documents that represented weeks of research into Cascade Tech Solutions, operations, and management practices. "How are you feeling?" she asked, as I settled into the chair that had become familiar over the past few weeks. "Ready," I said, and meant it. "The other board members will be joining us at 9:45 for a brief overview of the agenda," Patricia said, checking her watch. "I should warn you that some of them may be surprised by the scope of what we're proposing to discuss." "What kind of surprised?" "The kind that comes from learning that a majority shareholder they didn't know existed has been conducting a comprehensive review of management performance and has serious concerns about current leadership practices." I thought about Richard's condescending dismissal of Daniel's expertise, about Vanessa's cruel assessment of Tyler's enthusiasm, about all the employees whose talents were being wasted because they didn't fit someone else's narrow definition of leadership material. "They'll adjust," I said, "and if they don't, then they'll discover that board positions, like employment, depend on serving the interests of shareholders and stakeholders, rather than protecting the status quo." Patricia nodded approvingly. "I think you're going to do very well in corporate governance." The other board members arrived precisely on schedule, 3 individuals who represented the careful balance of industry expertise and fiduciary oversight that had guided Cascade Tech Solutions through years of steady growth. Patricia handled the introduction smoothly, and I found myself shaking hands with people who had no idea they were meeting the person who could single-handedly reshape the organization they helped oversee. Victoria brings a fresh perspective to our governance discussions, Patricia explained diplomatically. She's conducted extensive research into our operational effectiveness and employee satisfaction metrics. What kind of research? Asked Margaret Chen, a woman in her 50s whose background included executive positions at several successful technology companies. The kind that examines whether our management practices are aligned with our stated values of merit-based advancement and collaborative innovation, I said, choosing my words carefully. And what did you find? Asked Robert Martinez, whose LinkedIn profile indicated significant experience with corporate restructuring. Patterns of decision-making that suggest systematic bias in personnel management, inconsistent application of performance evaluation criteria, and employee retention problems that correlate with management style rather than company performance. The 3 existing board members exchanged glances that suggested they weren't entirely surprised by these findings. Margaret Chen spoke first. We've had concerns about employee satisfaction scores in certain departments, she said carefully. But management has consistently attributed those issues to industry-wide competition for talent rather than internal factors. What if I told you that exit interviews and performance reviews suggest otherwise? I asked, pulling out the research Patricia and I had compiled. For the next 20 minutes, I walked them through data that painted a clear picture of talented employees being systematically undervalued based on criteria that had nothing to do with their actual job performance. The board members asked intelligent questions and took careful notes, their professional skepticism gradually giving way to recognition that the patterns I was describing represented serious governance failures. This is troubling, Robert Martinez said finally. If these findings are accurate, we have a fiduciary responsibility to address management practices that are limiting the company's ability to retain and develop talent. I agree, I said. Which is why I think it's time to have a direct conversation with current leadership about expectations and accountability. At exactly 10 o'clock, Richard Blackwood arrived at the conference room with the kind of confident bearing that suggested he still believed he was walking into a routine administrative meeting. He was accompanied by Vanessa, whose presence surprised me until I remembered that she held some sort of consulting position with the company's marketing department. "Good morning," Richard said, settling into his chair at the head of the conference table with the easy authority of someone accustomed to controlling business conversations. "I understand there are some governance matters to discuss." "Several," Patricia said smoothly. "But first, I'd like to complete the introductions. Richard and Vanessa, meet Victoria Hayes, our newest board member and majority shareholder." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the heating system cycling on in the background. Richard's confident expression flickered, then reformed into something more cautious as he processed this information. "Majority shareholder," he said carefully. 62%, I said, meeting his eyes steadily. "Inherited from my father, who acquired his position through strategic investments over a 15-year period." Richard's gaze shifted to Vanessa, whose face had gone pale with what I recognized as the dawning realization that every condescending comment she'd made about my family had been directed at the person who ultimately controlled her husband's career. "I see," Richard said, his voice maintaining professional calm while his mind clearly raced through implications. "And you're here today because?" "Because I've completed a comprehensive review of company operations and have concerns about certain management practices that seem inconsistent with our stated values of merit-based advancement and collaborative innovation." I pulled out the folder of documentation Patricia and I had prepared and placed it on the conference table where everyone could see it. Specifically, I'm concerned about patterns of personnel decisions that appear to be based on subjective criteria rather than objective performance measures. Richard leaned forward slightly, his executive training kicking in as he recognized a serious challenge to his authority. "Could you be more specific about these concerns?" "I'd be happy to," I said, opening the folder to the first section of employee performance data. Let's start with the systematic pattern of passing over qualified candidates for advancement in favor of less experienced employees who happen to fit certain demographic profiles. For the next hour, I walked through case studies of talented employees whose careers had been limited by management decisions that couldn't be justified based on their actual work performance. I cited specific examples of performance reviews that praised technical competence while finding subjective reasons to question leadership potential. I presented exit interview data that showed a clear correlation between management style and employee retention rates. And I watched Richard Blackwood's confident demeanor gradually erode as he realized that every decision he'd justified as sound business judgment was being systematically dismantled by someone who'd done more thorough research into his management practices than he'd probably done himself. "These are serious allegations," Richard said when I finished presenting the data. "But I think there may be some context missing from this analysis. Personnel decisions are always complex, involving factors that aren't necessarily captured in formal documentation." Such as? Margaret Chen asked, her tone suggesting she was prepared to evaluate whatever additional context Richard wanted to provide. "Cultural fit, communication style, readiness for increased responsibility," Richard said, falling back on the euphemisms that had served him well in previous discussions. "Technical competence is just one factor in determining advancement potential. And how do you define cultural fit?" I asked quietly. Richard hesitated, clearly recognizing the trap inherent in that question. Alignment with company values, ability to work collaboratively with existing teams, comfort in client-facing situations. And who determines whether someone is comfortable in client-facing situations? Senior management, based on observations of employee behavior in professional settings. I thought about Daniel's humiliation at the company party, about the way Richard had reframed my husband's defense of his team's work as a social transgression rather than professional competence. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, "are you familiar with the Henderson Project timeline dispute that occurred at the recent company party?" Richard's face went carefully blank. "I recall some confusion about project details during a social event. And how did you handle that confusion?" I suggested the technical discussions might be better suited to a conference room rather than a cocktail party. By publicly dismissing the concerns raised by the project's lead engineer? By managing a potentially uncomfortable situation in a way that allowed all parties to maintain professional dignity. I looked around the conference table at the other board members, all of whom were following this exchange with the kind of attention that suggested they understood its significance. "Mr. Blackwood," I said carefully, "the lead engineer on the Henderson project happens to be my husband." The second silence was even more profound than the first. Vanessa made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a suppressed moan. Richard's face cycled through several expressions, before settling on something that might have been professional composure if you ignored the slight tremor in his hands. "I see," he said finally. "Do you?" I asked. "Because from where I was sitting, it looked like you systematically humiliated a talented employee for defending the accuracy of his team's work. And then you spent the following week offering him a choice between accepting a demotion or finding employment elsewhere. That transfer opportunity was offered as a development option," Richard said weakly. "To remove him from client-facing work because you questioned his judgment in professional social situations," I continued. "The same judgment he demonstrated by insisting on factual accuracy when clients were given misleading information about his project's performance." Robert Martinez cleared his throat. "Richard, is this an accurate characterization of recent personnel discussions?" Richard looked like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on ice that was much thinner than he'd realized. There may have been some miscommunication about the nature of that conversation. "What kind of miscommunication?" Margaret Chen asked. "The kind that results from performance reviews that praise technical excellence while finding subjective reasons to limit advancement opportunities," I said, pulling out Daniel's employment file. "The kind that creates systematic patterns of undervaluing employees who don't fit predetermined leadership profiles." I spread Daniel's performance documentation across the table where everyone could see it. Consistently excellent technical reviews. Client praise for project management and problem-solving abilities. Peer feedback that highlighted collaborative skills and mentorship of junior developers. This is the file of someone whose career advancement has been limited not by performance deficiencies, but by management decisions that can't be justified based on objective criteria, I said. And based on my research, he's not the only talented employee whose potential has been constrained by this approach to personnel management. Richard was no longer maintaining eye contact with anyone at the table. Vanessa looked like she was trying to disappear into her chair. Victoria, Margaret Chen said carefully, what outcome are you hoping to achieve through this review process? I thought about Tyler's enthusiasm for learning, about Daniel's dedication to excellence, about all the employees whose talents were being wasted because they didn't fit someone else's narrow definition of leadership material. I want Cascade Tech Solutions to become the kind of organization that actually values merit over connections. I said, the kind of workplace where talented people are recognized and developed based on their contributions rather than their social backgrounds. And if current management isn't capable of creating that kind of environment, Robert Martinez asked, I looked directly at Richard Blackwood, this man who had spent 3 years systematically undermining my husband while believing he was accountable to no one. Then current management will be replaced by people who are, I said simply. The final silence stretched for nearly a full minute before Patricia spoke. I think this would be an appropriate time for executive session, she said diplomatically. Richard, Vanessa, thank you for your time this morning. We'll be in touch about next steps. Richard stood up slowly, his movements careful and controlled in the way of someone who was trying not to show how thoroughly his world had just been dismantled. Vanessa followed him toward the door but paused before leaving. Victoria, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. Yes, I said, you do. I completely misjudged your situation and your family's circumstances. That was inexcusable, especially given my position with the company. Your position with the company? Margaret Chen asked. Vanessa handles some of our external marketing consulting, Richard said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining professional composure. I looked at the woman who had spent the company party explaining to me that my husband wasn't sophisticated enough for executive responsibilities, who had made my 8-year-old son feel self-conscious about his rock collection and Target shoes. I think we should review all of our consulting arrangements, I said to the other board members. Make sure they're aligned with our values and performance standards. Vanessa's face went pale again, but she nodded once and followed Richard out of the conference room. After they left, the 4 of us spent another hour discussing transition plans and performance standards, and the kind of leadership changes that would be necessary to create the merit-based environment I was committed to establishing. By noon, we had outlined a restructuring plan that would take effect within 30 days. I drove home through downtown Portland, past the building where Daniel was probably still sitting at his desk, unaware that his career constraints had just been systematically removed by a board meeting he knew nothing about. By the time I reached our house, Patricia had already called him to request his presence at an afternoon meeting to discuss new opportunities within the organization. Tyler bounded off the school bus at 3:15, his backpack full of rock samples, and his face bright with excitement about the geological formations he'd discovered during recess. Mommy, he said, spreading his latest specimens across the kitchen counter. I think I found some examples of contact metamorphism. That's when rocks change, because they get heated up by being close to igneous activity, but they don't get the pressure changes you see in regional metamorphism. That sounds very advanced, I said, examining the samples he'd carefully labeled with masking tape and his neat third-grade handwriting. Mrs. Patterson says I'm ready to start working with some of the high school geology resources, Tyler continued, carefully arranging his rocks according to their formation processes. She thinks I might be able to present my science fair project to the district science symposium. How do you feel about that? Tyler considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all scientific inquiries. Excited, he said finally. And maybe a little nervous, but Mrs. Patterson says that's normal when you're doing something important. Daniel arrived home at 5:30, with the kind of stunned expression that suggested his afternoon meeting with Patricia had covered considerably more ground than he'd expected. How did it go? I asked, though his face already told me everything I needed to know. They offered me Richard's position, Daniel said, settling heavily into his chair at the kitchen table. VP of Engineering Development, with authority over all technical projects and client relationships. And I have no idea how to process any of this, Daniel said, looking around our kitchen as if seeing it for the first time. This morning I was preparing to quit, rather than accept a demotion. Tonight I'm being offered the job I've been working toward for 3 years. Tyler looked up from his rock collection, sensing the adult significance of the conversation without fully understanding its context. Did something good happen at work, Daddy? Daniel reached over to examine one of Tyler's specimens, his hands still slightly unsteady from the afternoon's revelations. Something fair happened at work, he said carefully. Sometimes that's the same thing as something good. What do you mean? I mean that sometimes people don't get recognized for their talents because the system isn't designed to notice what they're good at, Daniel said. But when the system changes, talented people finally get the opportunities they deserve. Tyler nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to someone who spent his days studying how environmental changes could transform existing structures into something stronger and more stable, like metamorphic rocks, he said. Same materials, but better organized because of different conditions. Exactly like metamorphic rocks, Daniel agreed, meeting my eyes over our son's head. That evening, after Tyler was asleep and Daniel and I were sitting on the back porch with glasses of wine, and the comfortable silence that came from having navigated a major life transition successfully, I found myself thinking about power and responsibility, and the difference between using authority to maintain existing hierarchies and using it to create opportunities for people to flourish. Victoria, Daniel said finally, I need to ask you something. Okay. Are you planning to stay involved in the company's operations, or is this a one-time intervention to address the management problems? I considered the question, thinking about all the talented employees whose careers had been limited by systematic bias, about the responsibility that came with owning an organization that affected nearly 200 families. I think I'm planning to stay involved, I said, at least until we're sure the new systems are working the way they should. And after that, I'll probably discover that running a company according to principles I actually believe in is more interesting than I expected it to be. Daniel was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of having a wife whose career trajectory had just shifted from supporting his professional development to overseeing an entire organization. This changes everything for our family, he said eventually. Does it have to? Tyler's going to grow up as the son of people who own companies, instead of people who work for other people. That's a fundamentally different kind of childhood than either of us had. I thought about Tyler's methodical approach to learning, about his natural curiosity and collaborative spirit, about the teacher who had recognized his potential and was helping him access resources that matched his abilities. Maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, I said. Maybe it just means he'll grow up understanding that success comes with responsibility to help other people succeed too. And if he develops a sense of entitlement instead of a sense of responsibility, then we'll do what parents have always done when their children's behavior doesn't match their values, I said. We'll adjust the environmental conditions until better patterns emerge. Daniel laughed, the sound carrying relief and anticipation in equal measure. I love it when you apply Tyler's geology metaphors to child-rearing philosophy. It's not a metaphor, I said. It's just science. Create the right conditions, and natural processes tend to produce the outcomes you want. And if the natural processes don't produce the outcomes you want, I thought about Richard Blackwood's resignation letter, which Patricia had received that afternoon, along with a request for a generous severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. I thought about Vanessa's consulting contract, which had been quietly terminated with minimal disruption. I thought about all the systemic changes that would be implemented over the coming months to ensure that talented employees received opportunities that matched their abilities rather than their social connections. Then you change the environmental conditions and try again, I said, until you get a system that works for everyone who's willing to contribute their best efforts. 6 months later, Cascade Tech Solutions had the highest employee satisfaction ratings in its corporate history and had been featured in Portland Business Journal as an example of how merit-based management could drive both innovation and profitability. Daniel's project teams were consistently exceeding client expectations, and he'd been invited to speak at 3 industry conferences about collaborative development methodologies. Tyler's science fair project on metamorphic rock formation had won first place at the district symposium and qualified him for the state competition. Mrs. Patterson had connected him with graduate students at Portland State's geology department, who were helping him design experiments that were sophisticated enough to contribute to actual research publications. And I had discovered that running a company according to principles I actually believed in was not only more interesting than I'd expected, but more satisfying than any work I'd done before. Some structures, it turned out, became stronger and more beautiful when subjected to the right kinds of pressure. The key was knowing how to apply that pressure in ways that promoted transformation rather than destruction. As Daniel and I watched Tyler present his research findings to an auditorium full of high school students and community college professors, I found myself thinking about environmental conditions and natural selection, and the ways that systematic changes could create opportunities for everyone to reach their full potential. "He's going to change the world," Daniel whispered, his voice full of pride and wonder. "He already has," I whispered back. "He just helped us figure out how transformation really works." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.